All right, good evening, everyone. This is our fourth class, this is week 2. We have a few things that we're going to go through today before we get into the material. And so we're going to be covering CPR and airway management tonight. But before that, we're going to talk a little bit about the weather. I'm going to talk a little bit about some tasks that you have to complete. Call out some people for not having completed their tasks yet. This is routine stuff, so don't be too alarmed. And then we're going to walk through how to set up your National Registry account, right? So some important stuff that will hit this in the beginning here. So the first thing you see on the screen here is the decision support briefing from the National Weather Service. This map is updated as of, I believe, this afternoon. And so it's looking like in Walpole and up in Bethlehem that we're looking at the 8 to 12 inch or 6 to 8 inch mark. And then down in Concord, we're looking at 8 to 12 inches. And all of this is going to sort of kick off Saturday afternoon. So here's the thinking. We have instructors traveling from Maine. We have students traveling all over. And I would much rather have people sort of stay home than get themselves into a situation where driving is going to be very difficult. And so what we're going to do is we're going to cancel Saturday's class. Here's what the weather's looking like here. We're going to cancel Saturday's class, and instead, I've got some consensus from the instructors. We're going to extend the class times for the remaining Saturdays. So instead of cutting out at 3 p.m., we're going to push it to 4 or 5 p.m. So that's going to be a 9 to 5 class with an hour break. So about 7 hours of lab time. I understand if people's schedules conflict with this, we'll try to optimize the what we're doing during class time. But I do want to make sure that everyone has enough time and enough exposure to these skills in order to build the mastery that they need to be successful on the state exams. So what are people's thoughts on that?
Sounds good.
Yeah, that's good with me.
I find that as I get older, the excitement of driving through snowstorms diminishes greatly. Just not all about it anymore.
I'm bummed because I bet you we get like nothing up here. Guarantee it's gonna be nothing.
I also agree with that. I bet we're gonna get crap.
Like 3.
My area, we're supposed to get 6 to 12, and then we're right along the line to where we're supposed to get 12 plus.
Yeah, my husband's supposed to fly out of Boston tomorrow night, and they delayed his flight to Sunday.
I'm surprised they delayed it. I'm surprised they didn't even cancel it for the whole weekend.
No, they just delayed it. Well, we'll see. I mean, Sunday, when Sunday rolls around.
Yeah, take it day by day instead.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and the big issue is, especially for Bethlehem, one of the instructors is driving from Maine up to Bethlehem and then has to leave from Bethlehem and go back to Maine. And so that presents a pretty big safety hazard. You guys will get dope education, but if he dies on the road, then, the next class is down an instructor. So,
Hey, Max, question for you.
Yes, sir.
Did you guys sort of weigh the possibility of adding on an additional Saturday, or was that not a possibility?
So we did. That was the other option, is to push the final exam to March 5th, which is the week before the state skills exam. And so instead of adding a 6th and technically a 7th week to this 5-week course, we opted just to extend the existing Saturdays.
Okay. Thank you.
I got a quick question.
Yes, sir.
I asked Dave about study questions for the EMR National Registry. Do you have anything that we can have that we could start looking over questions right now?
Yeah, so all of the resources that I have are actually built for the EMT level. There aren't a whole lot of test prep materials out there for emergency medical responder.
Okay.
And
so if I use EMTB, the Pocket app, What do you think that's a good idea for the EMR National Registry?
Yeah, so there's no such thing as an EMTB. That was abolished about 10 years ago.
Yeah, I know, I understand that the app is actually called just EMTB. It's like this little app that has it's like a blue symbol or whatever, but it's based off questions off the registry. They just call it, the app's called EMTB.
Okay. Well, so
Yeah,
my
that's
concern,
not the
and I don't know that app, but my concern is, if they're calling it the name of the certification from back in 2006, then
Okay,
maybe some of the
yeah.
information's out of date. But as far as questions go, again, the National Registry isn't designed to trick you. Some of the questions that came from the textbook company for this course, to be perfectly honest, are a little bit garbage. So
Yeah.
poorly worded, some typos, some outdated information. So, I apologize for the quality of the questions.
Yeah,
However, the
clearly-
National Registry is really designed by a bunch of really smart people who are really good at what's called psychometrics, which is the sort of art and science of writing questions. So I think you guys, as long as you're focusing on the vocabulary in the textbook, as long as you're grasping the concepts, and most importantly, as long as you're able to demonstrate physical skill at your state BLS exam, you guys are going to be just fine.
So, I don't know if this is a dumb question, but I have my EMT practical completed. Do I need to still do my EMR practical because it's a different licensing?
It is a different certification
Okay.
entirely. So this course is not an EMT course. It has
Yeah.
nothing to do with EMT. If you look in the National Education Standards, you'll see that we cover the same topics, but we cover them with a different depth and breadth. And so you fundamentally don't learn the same information as an EMT course. We learn much less information in an EMR course than in an EMT course. So that said, let me switch over to the next presentation here. All right. All right.
Max, what was your background on your computer?
I have no idea.
No idea. Oh, it's one of the generic ones.
I have a folder full of wallpapers, and it just changes every 30 minutes.
I see.
All right, so my routine calling out of folks. First one, CPR card. So everyone in this class needed to have a CPR card just to sign up. And so the following people, if you could just upload your CPR card, that would be fantastic. And if you haven't uploaded it, you should know. And so easy peasy, you get a free grade out of it, pass fail. So
Wait a
go ahead
second.
and get the points. Upload your card.
Who are these people who have it, or?
These are the people who need to upload it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, if you have it, then you don't make the list. You've successfully completed the task. You're A-OK. Pass go, collect $200. That was a Monopoly reference for the kids. All right, so next thing here, FEMA certs. Remember, please remember, so you need to upload these before the end of the class. There are 3 FEMA certs required for this class: ICS 100, NIMS 700, and AWR 160. I required ICS 200 in the last class, and I found that people had a lot of trouble getting through all of the certifications. And so I've given you a whole week of no lectures in lab in order to complete your FEMA certifications, and I've eliminated 200 out of that, since that's something that's usually required for EMT level. So a bunch of people have uploaded 100, 200, and 700, which is a swing and a miss. So don't upload your 200. Please do your 160 and upload those. So there's a few people who haven't uploaded their 160. So if you've uploaded your certificates, just look at your score. If you didn't get a 4 out of 4 on this task, then there's something missing, and I've left you comments to know exactly what you're missing. All right, and then the following people, a bunch of folks, please email me your mailing address or drop it in a private chat here or send me a carrier pigeon or whatever you need to do. Just send me your mailing address so that I can put it on the course completion roster. If I don't have your mailing address, I can't add your name to the course completion roster, and you will not complete this course, and you cannot take the state BLS exam, and you cannot take the National Registry exam, and all of our time is wasted. So please, 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 please send me your mailing address as soon as you can. All right, so at this point, let's talk about your National Registry account. So the National Registry of Emergency Medical Technicians is the national level agency. They are a private organization with a government charter. They are the primary organization in the United States responsible for the testing and certification of pre-hospital professionals. All right. So this is not the state of New Hampshire. This is also not the federal government. They're a third party. And all of the states except for, I believe, 3 states use the National Registry's certifications in their licensing process. All right. So this is the national certification. And so this is the certification that you are going to test for at the end of this class. In order to test for your National Registry certification, you have to have an account with them. All right, so I have an account with them as a program director, and if you make an account with them, I can give you an authorization to test. And so this is how you're going to make an account. So if you haven't already gone to nremt.org or type into Google NREMT and click on their website, and made an account using the login or create account button, big red button at the top of the screen there, please do so. It's easy to make an account. Just make sure that you remember what email address you use. One of the biggest issues I had with previous classes is people are making these accounts with email addresses that they don't use, and so then they're having trouble accessing their authorization to tests. So just like the Fire Academy application, if you use an email address that you don't check, you're going to be left out of this process. We're not going to be able to contact you. We're not going to be able to give you authorization to test. So please use a valid email address. Once you create your account, you'll be taken to the candidate dashboard, and there'll be a blue button at the bottom of the dashboard that says Create Certificate Application. This is the button that creates your certificate application. And so you should click on this, and it will launch the following wizard. All right, so you'll have this 5-step wizard, and you'll be required to check a bunch of boxes, enter some dates, so on and so forth. So let's walk through that process to show you exactly what it will look like. So this class is preparing you to take the emergency medical responder exams, and so that's the box you want to check here. Once you check that, you can hit next. It'll bring you to a verification of the information. So it'll display your first and last name, the email address, your mailing address, so on and so forth. Just verify that all of that information is correct, and then you'll be able to go to the next page. At this point, you will declare any shenanigans that you got up to over the previous lifetime. If you have any documented shenanigans with law enforcement, you'll have to declare that. And they'll sort of ask you to explain what shenanigans you were up to and make a determination whether or not they were serious enough to not let you take the exam. In my case, I have lived a entirely dull and boring life, and so I can click none of the above apply. And then they just want to make sure that you solemnly swear that you have been up to no mischief, and then you can click agree and submit. Then it will ask you, when does your CPR expire? Now, I cannot tell you when your CPR expires. However, because you took CPR and it remained valid through the end of this course, you should be able to enter your own CPR date as printed on your CPR card. So if you don't know what this date is, take a look at the CPR card that you uploaded, and that should have the answers. All will be revealed. Once you've done that, click Next. All right. So I believe they still have this up there due to COVID-19. There's a bunch of stuff that went on with testing and certification and so on and so forth. Most of these things have expired, but just in case it's still up there, this is what the message looks like. So this screen is going to want to know when you completed this program. So for your records, this program finishes on 2/26/22. All right. So you will enter 02/26/2022 in this box. If you get this date wrong, not a big deal. I can actually go in and change this date once you affiliate with me. So not a big deal. So enter the date that you completed this EMR program and click next. And then you need, this is the important part. This is really important. You need to select which state that the program was put on in. And in case you didn't know, it's New Hampshire. It will remain New Hampshire, hopefully. And then which of the EMT programs is your program, right? So in this case, you're going to select the instructor coordinator, the instructor of record, and that is me. So I'm the guy who's doing all the paperwork. And so if you forget what this looks like and you lose access to the internet and you can't view this video on YouTube, then it's actually printed at the top of your syllabus that was emailed to you. So that PDF syllabus that I sent you. So my instructor coordinator number, my badge number, so to speak, is NH50423. And so you're going to be able to hit this drop-down list. You're going to be able to scroll down to the bottom and or somewhere in the middle, and you'll see NH50423 Peter Dodge. That is me. All right. So once you select that, hit next. And then it's going to give you an option on whether you will do an on-site or an online test, right? And so what is the difference? Well, you can click that link and find out what the difference is, but let me tell you what the experience has been as conveyed to me by people who have taken the online version. In the on-site version, you go to a building. It is a secure facility. There are lockers. You have to empty out your pockets. They're going to verify your ID. They're going to take a palm scan to allow you in and out of the room, and you are locked in the room for the period of time with a whiteboard and a grease marker and just sort of sent on your way, right? You can take the test like that. You go in, you take your test, you leave, you're done, right? You don't have to do any of the legwork in terms of security. If you elect to do the online exam, you have to supply an empty room with that is free of anything on the walls. You have to have a webcam. You have to scan all surfaces of that room with your webcam. You have to mount the webcam high up so that it can look down on your hands and your keyboard. You have to keep your hands visible at all times while you're taking the test. And if anyone knocks on the door, or opens the door, or comes in and interrupts your exam at any time, you fail. So what I've heard is that the online version is a little bit prohibitive. It's a little bit difficult to manage their security standards in a normal home environment, and it was sort of flaky, right? So if your personal risk assessment allows, I highly recommend that you just schedule one of these exams at a testing center and go and take it. Much fewer gray hairs on your part, but the option is yours, of course. So once you click next here, you're going to verify all the information that you just entered. You're going to agree to an attestation, and then you're going to submit your application. Once you submit your application, it will pop up on a screen that I can see. And then once the class is complete, I will give you what's called an authorization to test, or an ATT. Once you complete your final exam in the EMR course, I'll give you that ATT, and you'll be able to schedule your cognitive exam within 24 hours, right? So you will actually be able to take your computer-based cognitive exam before you show up for the state skills exam. So you could have your license as soon as the week after your skills exam if you were really motivated to do so. I'm going to submit the roster for the class following the final skills evaluation that Sunday or that Saturday evening. And so your course completion roster will go into the state. They'll be able to process it that Monday. And so we're going to get the ball rolling on this very, very quickly. So if you were so motivated, you could definitely finish this course and have a state license in your hand within a couple weeks of finishing this course. So
I got a
again,
quick question, Max. Sorry to interrupt.
yep, go ahead.
What's the final date of the class that we would put in the application?
So
Okay, right there.
the course
Yep.
end date is 2/26/2022.
Okay.
And this is also the last day on your syllabus. So if you look at the big schedule on the last page of your syllabus, the last box with a date in it is the last day that we will have class. That is the end date. And so I'm actually going to submit the course completion roster on that date. And then down at the very bottom of the schedule, you see state BLS exam. I scheduled that exam before you guys took the signed up for the course, and so that's going to be your National Registry Skills exam as proctored by the state, and I have nothing to do with that.
All right. I'm just having. Am I still muted? No. I'm trying to find your for the EMR program on the application. I can't find your name. Or is it New Hampshire Bureau of EMS 510? Or
I'm not sure what you're looking at.
it says, which of these is your EMR program?
Right, so you should be able to select my name, NH50423.
Yeah, you're not there. 50, no. You're 50423?
That is my instructor coordinator number, yep.
Okay, because it says Peter Dodge.
Yes, it does.
Okay.
Yep. Can you see the screen that I'm sharing?
Yeah, I see you now. But it says your name is Max, man. Like on the here in the classroom, it says Max Dodge.
Yes, it does.
All right. He was there. That's all.
All right.
So I actually had a question regarding that. So is Max your middle name?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
That's where I got a little confused there.
Understandable.
Do you know what Jack Settley, out of curiosity?
I do not. Doesn't ring a bell.
Oh, okay.
Oh, actually, I think I do. Is he an
I think you
infantryman?
do. Yeah, he's an infantryman.
Yes.
So, yeah, okay.
Yep. I know him. I believe I've slept in the mud with that man.
Yeah, I think there's a photo of you guys somewhere on Facebook or something. I've been friends with him since high school. That's all.
That's possibly frightening. I'm not sure.
Yeah, if you've met anything knucklehead stuff that he's told you about previous years, I was most likely involved. So
that man is a consummate
yeah.
professional with unimpeachable integrity.
yeah.
All right, so what we're going to do now is we're actually going to talk about CPR.
Put in for a completion date.
Say that one more time.
The completion date.
What's the course completion date?
Yes.
All right, the course completion date is 02/26/2022.
Thank you.
And that's on the website you showed for the National Registry?
Yes, so all of this takes place through the National Registry website, and so that's nremt.org.
Okay.
And so here
So-
I have a browser, so nremt.org. And that will bring you up to this website here. This is the National Registry of EMT's website.
Okay. So in the licensure education, It asked in what states are you currently licensed. So would I just not put
Are you currently
put I am
licensed
not
as an
currently-
EMT in any state?
no.
Okay.
So put that even though we're taking this class to become.
You do not currently have a license, and so
Okay.
you can't say that you're licensed.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yep. All right. Any other questions about signing up for the National Registry? I'll keep
Looks
that.
like they're not even offering online testing anymore, so that
Perfect.
shouldn't
Don't have to
confuse
worry
people
about it then,
anymore.
huh?
Yeah.
It really was a pain in the rear end, so we're better off this way. All right, so let's dig into CPR. Now, everyone here already has a CPR certification, and so I am not going to belabor this too much. It's going to be a very brief overview of CPR. And then when we practice CPR, not this weekend, but next weekend, we're going to do something called high performance CPR, which is a team-based CPR. So you may have done 1 and 2 rescuer CPR in your CPR course. What we're going to practice is 2 to 5 person CPR, where everyone has a role. There's going to be 2 people doing compressions, a person doing the airway, a person manning the AED, a person writing stuff down. And so one of the ways that we measure success in CPR is something called the chest compression fraction, or CCF. And so we're gonna be doing a little bit of whiteboard math, and we're gonna be timing the amount of time spent doing compressions versus the entire length of the code, and we'll be giving you a score to determine, how well your teamwork allows for good CPR. And so that'll be a fun challenge for you folks when we get back together. So this, of course, is guided by the National EMS Education Standard Competencies, and you can find these competencies on ems.gov. And so this falls under the shock and resuscitation. We're also going to touch a little bit on the assessment piece, and mostly this falls under the primary assessment. So we're aware of the airway breathing circulation assessment that we practiced last week, and CPR is primarily driven by what's called a CAB, or circulation airway breathing. And this goes back to the assessment of life threats. If you'll remember, there's no condition more life-threatening than not having a heartbeat. And so the focus of CPR is to find the absence of that heartbeat and correct it immediately using chest compressions. And so that's why you'll see the CAB assessment. Of course, this requires a little bit of understanding of anatomy and physiology, and so while we already had the human body and body systems lecture, I believe Dave covered that material, really we need to keep engaging with anatomy and physiology because it's really the underpinning of everything that we do. And then, of course, pathophysiology, as it's covered in EMS, refers mostly to shock. All right, so CPR consists of 3 major skills. We have the assessment, or the identification that there's a problem with circulation. We're going to open the airway. We're going to initiate artificial ventilation. And then, of course, we're providing chest compressions. So airway and breathing skills may be life-saving for a patient whose heart is still beating. Not everyone who's unconscious is, of course, without a heartbeat. In most cases, the heart has also stopped beating, right? And rescue breathing alone will not save these patients. In fact, we've moved from bystander CPR being the mouth-to-mouth that we're familiar with from TV and movies to a hands-only CPR, because the idea of putting your mouth on a stranger's face was so repelling to a majority of Americans that they would just not do CPR at all. And so we've moved away from the breathing and gone to hands-only CPR, because if you were to pick only one out of those two, chest compressions is what's going to save a life. Every compression that you don't give is a heartbeat that this person doesn't have. And so the circulatory system must be functional in order to carry oxygen to the body, so it doesn't matter how well you're providing ventilations if their heart isn't beating. So to maintain or restore circulation manually, we perform cardiac compressions, or closed chest cardiac massage. And this is just fancy ways to say we press on their chest to squeeze their heart on the inside. To maintain both breathing and heartbeat, rescue breathing and chest compressions are usually done together. Around 70% of patients who experience cardiac arrest are in what's called ventricular fibrillation. And this is where the heart muscle is just quivering. It's not effectively pumping blood. And so what we're doing is we're pressing on their chest until we can get what's called an automated external defibrillator, or an AED, to deliver an electrical shock to organize the rhythm of that heart muscle so it can start beating in a more effective way. So just a quick recap of the circulatory system. We know that the circulatory system broadly is composed of three components: a pump, the pipes, and then some kind of fluid to provide pressure. So the pump, the pipes, and the pressure. The pump is obviously referring to the heart, which is a muscular hollow organ, and so whenever that muscle contracts, it creates a heartbeat. It squeezes the blood out to the body. And then we have a series of blood vessels, the pipes that contain that blood and deliver it out to the tissues of our body that require oxygenation. And then the blood itself, which is its own type of connective tissue. It's a vastly complex organ system all in itself. So the heart, which is about the size of your fist, is located in the chest between your lungs. It's connected in the center of your chest and sort of hangs off to the left side. It consists of 4 chambers, 2 on the right and 2 on the left, or if you prefer, 2 on the top and 2 on the bottom. So each of those top chambers is called an atrium. The right atrium receives blood from the veins of the body, sort of the low pressure receiving area for the blood. And then the left atrium receives this highly oxygenated blood from the lungs. So again, a low pressure chamber that just sort of collects the blood from the lungs. And then you have the lower chambers, and those are both called ventricles. And so your right ventricle pumps that deoxygenated blood up into the lungs in order to pick up the oxygen from the atmosphere. And then again, it empties out into that left atrium. And then the left ventricle is the big muscular ventricle of the heart, and this is the ventricle that creates the pressure wave that we can feel as a pulse and provides enough force to get all of that blood out to where it needs to go into the body. And so these 4 chambers of the heart work in a well-ordered sequence. And so you see at first the top chambers of the heart, these two atria here, they sort of squeeze in order to prime the ventricles down the bottom and give them the maximum amount of blood flow that they need in order to create a good pressure. And then the bottom 2 will squeeze after the top 2 in order to deliver the blood where it needs to go. So again, the right side of the heart here pushes blood up into the lungs, and then the left side of the heart here pushes blood out to the rest of the body. So arteries always carry blood away from the heart. And so the walls of the artery are usually thick because they have to stand up to the pressure of the ventricles. Smaller arteries eventually branch into what's called capillaries, and the capillaries are the smallest pipes in the circulatory system. They're also the thinnest. And so this is where oxygen diffuses through the walls of the capillaries into the tissues. And so there's no cell in your body that's more than about 5 cell widths away from some sort of capillary, right? And so just to give you an idea, they're everywhere. And then eventually what happens is the capillary bed will empty into the venous system. And veins are generally thinner walled pipes. They don't have to deal with the same high pressure, and they carry blood back to the heart. And this blood has been used up. All of the oxygen is taken away from it. It's loaded with waste products and carbon dioxide from the process of energy making in each of your cells. And so this blood is carried back up to the heart. It's refilled with oxygen. You breathe out the CO2 and the and other waste products, and then you're ready to go again. So there are 4 major artery locations that you can possibly feel a pulse. If you find the artery, you can feel the pulse. And the ones that we are most familiar with are the carotid artery in the neck and the radial artery in the wrist. However, as we learned in CPR, in infants, we can reach into their upper arm and we can feel their brachial artery, right? And the reason we can do this on infants and not larger people is that once you start fighting against gravity over the course of a lifetime, and especially if you're physically fit, the big biceps muscle, the biceps brachii is what it's called, it gets larger and firmer and more difficult to push out of the way. And so while you can, if you push that muscle out of the way, you can get up in there and feel it in an adult if you're really trying. It's much easier to feel it in an infant that doesn't have that muscle tone. And then the 4th one on the list here is the femoral artery. And this is up in the groin. And so there's a triangle between the top of the quadriceps muscle, that thigh muscle on the front of your leg, the bone that forms the front of your pelvis, and then your genitalia. So there, that little triangle there called the femoral triangle, if you press your fingers into that in the right area, you'll feel a pulse. And so if you're really good with your anatomy, this is a reasonable place to check a pulse if you can't feel it in the wrist. Although for practical purposes, there's really no reason to check a femoral artery at our level, right? If it's either in the wrist or it's in the neck, or they're an infant and we're checking it in the arm. And there's lots of other places that you can check a pulse. Anytime you can press an artery against a bone, you can feel a pulse. But we're going to focus on the ones that are easiest to find. And so here we see the carotid, sort of coming, sweeping down from the cartilaginous structures of the center of your neck, your windpipe and your voice box and all that. We're going to sweep towards the outside and get into that little divot between their windpipe and the big muscle of their neck, and you should be able to feel the carotid pulse there. And then again on the wrist, we come in on the thumb side. We should feel the bone sweeping in towards the middle of the wrist. There's this little depression between that bone and your first tendon that activates your fingers. You'll feel the radial pulse there. And then in infants, we can sort of squish their entire arm in. We don't have to worry about moving muscles around because they haven't made big muscles yet. We can feel the brachial artery there. And then you can see that's a rough estimation of where you'll find the femoral pulse. So just lateral. So again, a vocabulary term there. Lateral means towards the outside of the body. So it's just lateral to the genitalia, above the large muscle of the thigh, and below the bony crest of your hips. That's where you'll find the femoral artery. All right, so let's talk a little bit about blood, because blood is fascinating. And if anyone's interested in blood, I can literally talk your ear off about how awesome blood is and all the things that it does for us. But for the purposes of this class, blood has 3 major components, right? Most of blood, around 55% of blood, is plasma. And this is just basically yellow water. It's water, it's dissolved electrolytes, it's a few other things, right? But if you ever get a vial of blood and spin it down in a centrifuge, you'll just see this as sort of the yellowish fluid inside your body. And then the other part of it, about 45% of your blood, are the actual oxygen carrying blood cells, right? And these are the little things that look like Cheerios, red Cheerios. And they're filled with the protein that binds with oxygen, carries it around your body. Really super important stuff. Fascinating little cells. And then about 1% of your blood is the white stuff, right? So white blood cells of all types. So this is basically the products of your immune system. And then a bunch of stuff that helps with forming clots, like platelets and fibrin and other stuff like that. And so why am I telling you this? Well, I just want you to know that about half of your blood is the oxygen carrying stuff, and about half of your blood is the fluid that carries it around, right? And that's really all you need to know about that. So again, if you were to take a blood sample in a test tube and you were to either let it sit for about 20 minutes or a half an hour, or you were to spin it down in a centrifuge, you'd actually see the blood separate, and all the solid stuff would sink to the bottom and all the fluid would be left on top. And you'd see about half of that vial, just letting it sit there in the test tube, about half of that vial would be red, and the other half would be sort of a straw-colored clear fluid, right? And that's your blood cells and your plasma. So going back to cardiac arrest. So arrest means that it has stopped, right? And there's a couple different arrests that we'll talk about in medicine, but cardiac arrest is when your cardiac muscle or your heart stops, right? And this is as precisely terrible as it sounds. Cardiac arrest occurs when the heart stops beating, when there's no more contraction, which means that no more blood is being pumped through the vessels, which means that without the supply of blood, the cells of the body will starve of oxygen and nutrients and start to die, right? So first they're going to switch over to this really dirty form of energy production. They're going to make a lot of waste product, and then they're going to basically stop functioning. And so different tissues in your body have a different amount of time that they'll last before there'll be some kind of permanent damage. And so some of the hardiest stuff in your body are like muscle cells, right? They can go hours without any sort of serious damage to the cells themselves. On the other hand, there are some organs in your body that will only last minutes before there's permanent damage. And one of those organs is your brain. And so you'll notice anyone here who's ever done martial arts or jiu-jitsu or wrestling or something like that, you put someone into a chokehold, right? You're not actually choking them. You're not cutting off their air supply. You're actually compressing their blood vessels. And what happens when you put someone in a headlock for, 30, 40 seconds? Anyone who's ever done martial arts can tell you.
Pass out? Yeah.
Yeah, they pass out, right? And why are they passing out? It's not because you cut off their air supply. It's because you cut off the supply of blood to their brain. And so we see that this person goes from being alert, right? Alert and, engaging in whatever sport that you're doing, to within 30 seconds being unconscious, right? They go from A to U in a few seconds. And the same thing is going to happen if your heart stops beating. They're going to go very quickly from being conscious to being unconscious, because the brain is one of the most sensitive organs in your body when it comes to supply of oxygen. And so you'll lose consciousness, and then your brain cells will sort of keep chugging along trying to figure out what's going on, and they're going to be burning up energy, and they're going to be using oxygen this whole time. And eventually they're just going to run out. And at that point, you're going to start, those cells are going to start dying. And so we see that within about 4 to 6 minutes is when the brain cells will start dying, and you'll start to have permanent brain damage. And this is referred to as a hypoxic brain injury. That's not vocabulary you need to know, but that's what it's called. And then probably 8 to 10 minutes, this damage becomes irreversible, right? So within 4 to 6 minutes, if you're able to restore the flow of blood and oxygen, you may see that they'll have some short-term deficits, but after about 10 minutes, we see that that they start to experience difficulty with daily tasks. If you get them back, they'll experience difficulty. And then for every minute after that, or I'm sorry, for every, was it minute? 10 minutes. Well, for every minute after that, their chances of survival decrease by about 10%, right? And so that's why you want to get on their chest and start pressing early, and that's why we want to deliver the electricity, the defibrillation, as soon as possible to try to get that heart beating again. So cardiac arrest may have many different causes. So we have heart and blood vessel diseases like heart attacks, strokes. We have, if they are unable to breathe, or what's called respiratory arrest, they'll go into a cardiac arrest eventually. And then we have some medical emergencies, seizures, diabetes, allergic reactions. They can get electrocuted, they can be poisoned, certain drug overdoses. So for example, if you were to overdose on heroin, heroin suppresses your ability to breathe. You can only go so long without taking a breath before your body is starved of oxygen. And once the heart is starved of oxygen, it begins the process of going into cardiac arrest. And so that's how we can see a drug overdose can lead to death. Similarly, drowning, suffocation. And then obviously if we have some major trauma and we lose a lot of the blood, if the blood isn't in your body, it cannot deliver oxygen to your tissues. And so if you bleed out, you will eventually go into cardiac arrest and die. So all of that sort of makes intuitive sense once you understand the anatomy underneath it. All right, Andrew, what's you got a question?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, based off of your experience, the reasons for cardiac arrest, are they a majority of them in any given category on that last slide there? You know, a lot of those, or half of those, were related to respiratory arrest, I guess, right?
Yeah, so in America, the primary cause of cardiac arrest is heart disease. We are just an extraordinarily unhealthy population. Our costs of healthcare are going up, and our life expectancy is actually going down. So we're paying a lot more as a population to be unhealthy, and so we see that heart disease is one of the leading causes of death in America. It's I think number 3. In 2020, number 2 was COVID, but before 2020, 2019 timeframe, I believe heart disease was actually the number 3 or number 2 cause of death in America. And so that's going to be heart and blood vessel disease. And so these other things are things that you'll run into. So for example, in children, respiratory mechanisms are the leading cause of cardiac arrest because they just haven't lived long enough to smoke the cigarettes and eat the cheeseburgers required for significant heart disease. It's not always the case, but primarily in children we see that it's respiratory driven. But overwhelmingly in the adult population, both male and female, but of course affecting males more, we see that it's blood vessel and heart disease. Does that answer the question?
Absolutely. Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. It's a good question. All right, so let's talk about CPR. So just as you learned in your CPR class, we use the CAB approach because, again, chest compressions are really what's going to save a life. So how does this differ from your normal primary survey? It really doesn't, because you're going to walk up, you're going to form your general impression. You know, I see a mid-60s, obese white male laying on the ground looking gray. That's not great. Mr., are you okay? Shake the shoulders, a little sternal rub. He's unresponsive, right? We're going to assess for life threats. And in your CPR class, that looks like open the airway, look, listen, and feel, check for a pulse, right? Which we know as an ABC assessment. And as soon as you recognize that he doesn't have a pulse and he's not breathing, what is the next thing that we do?
CPR.
Chest compressions.
Exactly, chest compressions. So How does this differ from our primary survey that we practiced last Saturday? It really doesn't. It really doesn't. But what we're counting on is that you are, again, recognizing that we teach these skills sequentially, but we expect you to practice them simultaneously. And so when you go into a CPR course, you'll notice, Annie, are you okay? Open the airway, look, listen, and feel. Check for a pulse, sort of all at the same time. Recognize that this person is in cardiac arrest sort of within 10 seconds. Call for help, get additional resources on the way, get the AED on the way, and start chest compressions almost simultaneously, right? And so I told you when we talked about primary survey that this is something that you should be able to do within the span of a single breath hold on the part of you as a rescuer. And in CPR, we practiced a primary survey in 10 seconds, right? And so I think that sort of reinforces the skill of primary survey. So how does this differ? How does CAB differ from general impression, level of consciousness, assessment of life threats, airway, breathing, circulation in your primary assessment? I think it really doesn't, right? But we put it as CAB because we want to emphasize the importance of chest compressions in terms of not just saving this person's life, right? Because if we're doing good chest compressions, we will get them to the hospital. They will get to the cath lab or wherever they need to go in order to fix the problem. But really, what happens after? What happens after they go to the cath lab? What happens when they wind up in the hospital for a week or 10 days? What happens when they go to leave the hospital? Are they going to be able to walk out under their own power? Are they going to be able to recognize their grandkids and their loved ones? Are they going to be able to engage in the activities that they once enjoyed? And the answer is, if you don't do good chest compressions, right? If you're not circulating that blood, and if you're not using airway management skills, I'm going to teach you the second half of this evening, then the answer is no. You may save their life, but when they get out of the hospital, they will not have a quality of life unless we're doing excellent high-performance CPR, and that's really what we want to emphasize with this CAB assessment. Does a paramedic have a different CPR card than you as an EMR? Nope. We all have healthcare provider level CPR. Does a physician do different chest compressions than you as an EMR? No, actually, you probably do better chest compressions because you do them more often, right? So, this is really the great equalizer here. It doesn't matter what your certification level is. Don't let anyone tell you that you're just an ambulance driver. When it comes to CPR, you can absolutely make a difference in this person's quality of life 10 days, 2 weeks down the road, as long as you're doing high-quality CPR. All right, so I think I've beaten that dead horse into glue. Let's move on. So again, you have to combine the airway and breathing skills with your circulation skills. You're going to be checking for a pulse. Make sure you're down there for that 5 seconds checking for a pulse. What we've found when we've studied this using science is that if you're not really good at finding a pulse, if you're not really good at that skill of checking a pulse, that rescuers will feel a pulse when there's none. They're actually feeling their own pulse. Or they'll miss the pulse that the patient has and they'll start performing CPR, and then the person wakes up and they're very upset. Which, to me, still a win. But we want to make sure that we're doing the skill correctly. You get down there for those 5 seconds, check for the pulse. Make sure that when you're checking for breathing, that you're down there for a good 10 seconds, because again, what is the normal respiratory rate for an adult human? Normal respiratory rate.
12 to 20.
12 to 20.
12 to 20, right? So what is 12 to 20 when we're talking about breaths per, or seconds per breath, right? If you were going to breathe for this person, you'd give them a breath every how many seconds if you want them to breathe 12 times a minute?
Isn't it 30?
So if I want someone to breathe 12 times in a minute,
Oh,
I'm going to give them a breath every how many seconds? Brian got it in the chat. So every 5 seconds, right? Right. So if I go down there for 4 seconds, it is entirely possible that I will miss them breathing at a normal rate. And if they're breathing slightly slowly, like 8 times a minute, right? And I go down there and I only check for 5 or 6 seconds, it is entirely possible that I will entirely miss their breathing, right? And it's important to know if they're breathing, because here's a truth bomb for you. If they're breathing, they have a heartbeat. You cannot breathe if your heart is stopped, right? And likewise, if they're not breathing, their heart may still be beating, but you have to check that check for that pulse. So make sure you spend the 10 seconds down there, just like the CPR skill sheet says. Spend the 10 seconds down there and make sure that they're breathing, right, while checking a pulse. CPR by itself can't sustain life indefinitely. It is an important part of the process, but one of the things that we need in order for this patient to have a high likelihood of survival is defibrillation. The heart is much better at pumping blood than your hands are, and this should be not a surprise to anyone here. So let's do this. So it is about 3 minutes before the top of the hour, before I get into the chain of survival. Let's take a 10-minute break. Be back here at 10 past 7, and we'll dig back into this slide deck, and we'll finish it up and head into airway. So take 10. All right, so the cardiac chain of survival, this is a concept that was most likely introduced during your CPR class. And this is the sort of the events that need to occur in a successful resuscitation of someone in cardiac arrest. So it starts with recognition of arrest, activation of your emergency response system. Remember that CPR is a team sport, so even if you are certified in CPR, you really do want to have a bunch of extra people there to help you out, and we'll see more of that when we get together next Saturday to practice this. And so here is one of the many representations of the chain of survival. Here we have early recognition, immediate high-quality CPR. You want to defibrillate as soon as possible, understanding that the longer we wait before defibrillation, the lower the chances of survival. We want to get an ALS ambulance on the way, not because that they do better CPR than us, but because the paramedics on an ALS ambulance have access to a bunch of additional medicines, more advanced monitoring devices, more advanced airway control, and so they can make the whole process of CPR easier on everyone. And then important is delivering them to a hospital that is capable of taking care of them. Which is going to be pretty much any emergency room that we have here in the state of New Hampshire. So let's talk about when to start CPR. So again, what do you think the important characteristic of a patient who requires CPR is? What is the one thing they need to not have in order for CPR to be useful?
They need to have a head.
Okay,
A pulse.
wasn't expecting that.
Breathing.
I just laughed at that chapter because it just seemed pretty self-explanatory that you wouldn't do CPR on a decapitated patient.
It does make it a little bit more difficult. So CPR needs to be started on all non-breathing pulseless patients unless they're obviously dead. And so instead of belaboring this point with the slides, I want to bring up the protocols, right? Because this is always a good place to start. So let's talk about, let's see, yep, okay, not refusal. Let's talk about when not to start CPR. So in medical legal, we will discuss what a do not resuscitate order is, or an advance directive is. And so for the most part, you will be looking at these with people who have terminal diseases or people who are very elderly. Any person in which the the subject of their imminent demise has been discussed and documented, and they have specific wishes for their care if they were to need resuscitation, right? So remember that a do not resuscitate order does not mean don't care. It just means that there's certain procedures that you're not going to do, and CPR may be one of them. So if they have a DNR, make sure you check that. Another reason not to start CPR, and we talk about this extensively in wilderness medicine, is if the physical environment is not safe for providers. So we think of like, okay, if you're outside and it's blowing a gale and a tree is going to land on you, and there's a forest fire and there's wild animals attacking and whatnot. Sure, but that never happens. What's more likely is you're going to go into a home where the house is unsafe. Right, so you're working a cardiac arrest in a hoarder home, and the air quality is going to make you sick, or there's hazmat in the area, or there's violent family members, or something like that. So remember that the safety of you first, your crew second, the patient third, are all things that you want to take into consideration. So Daniel asks, how would you know if they have a DNR or not? And that's a great question. Most of the time, it's going to be someone coming up and saying, this person has a DNR, right? At which point you're going to ask to see the DNR. And we'll talk more about DNRs when we talk about medical legal. And then what the slides were discussing. Oh, hold on. We have a question. Yes, Catherine.
So with the DNRs, so say they're at home and medically they do have a DNR. Would they have to have a copy of that DNR or
Yes.
some kind of physical evidence? Okay.
Yes, they would. And tattoos across your chest, or knuckle tattoo that says DNR, jewelry that says DNR. None of that is a legally binding document signed by the patient and a physician that allows you to withhold certain types of care. And so we're going to dig more into DNRs when we talk about medical legal. There's a whole section on it, and we're going to really dig in deep on it. But for now, just know that if they do have a valid do not resuscitate order, that you should not resuscitate. But again, that does not mean don't care for them. Just don't do, these sort of traumatic procedures like CPR and things like that, and advocate for them. So like if a paramedic gets on scene and they're not really aware of what happened before they got there, and they try to slide a breathing tube in or something like that, you're going to want to advocate for the patient. Hey, look, we have a signed DNR. It appears to be valid. Here it is. And sort of make care decisions as a team. So the other thing that the slides talk about is don't do CPR on people who are obviously dead. And so in the state of New Hampshire, we have the signs and factors of death. And so we will, I believe, touch on this again. But signs of death, if they are terminally unresponsive, if they are not breathing, if they do not have pulses, if you shine a light in their eyes and their pupils aren't moving, and if you put a stethoscope on their chest and you don't hear a heartbeat, those are all strongly indicative that this person may be dead. But they in themselves do not make a dead person. You also have to have factors. And so the factors are some sort of damage or destruction of the body that is incompatible with living, such as removal of the head, as was talked about on the slides. Very difficult to survive a decapitation. No known cases where someone has successfully been resuscitated once the head is removed. Super popular form of removal of power in the French era back in the 16 and 1700s. Just to give you an indicator of how really bad it is for your health. So yes, if the head is removed, do not resuscitate. Also, decomposition of some or most of the body, right? So if you see that they've started to turn into compost, definitely CPR is not your priority there. Deforming brain injury, and by deforming we mean like physically the shape of the head has changed to be somehow non-head shaped, or removal of part or all of the head. Incineration, big no-no. and we're talking more than just a sunburn. We haven't gotten into to burns and soft tissue injury yet, but incineration would be somewhere along the lines of that 4th degree burn, where again, part of or all of your body is missing. We also see lividity or rigor mortis, and those are two different things. Lividity is sort of this discoloration that occurs when you've been dead for a long time and blood starts pooling. You start to see these big bruises, like massive purple bruises on the underside of the body, or whatever part of the body is facing down. Rigor mortis happens a couple hours after death, and it's really sort of a really neat biochemical reaction that happens in the body that, fun fact, we don't fully understand yet. It turns out that medical science doesn't really care about what happens after medicine is no longer useful. So we're still exploring some of these things. Super fascinating. If you're interested, we'll talk about it. And then major blunt or penetrating trauma that's incompatible with life. So I don't know if you've seen that classic movie from the 90s, Death Becomes Her, but there's a scene in the movie where there's like an enormous hole that's taken out of the center of this person's body, and she's already dead, so you don't have to worry about it. But it's big enough where you can actually reach your hand through and hold a candlestick. And that, if you see it in real life, like, for example, if someone's shot with, I don't know, a cannon or something, that would be a major blunt or penetrating trauma incompatible with life. So, Daniel, thank you. Definitely dated myself by that movie reference. Andrew, you have a question.
Yes, sir. So I'll make it real quick. I went to or I went to a call probably within the last couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
It's a climbing accident. Guy fell from probably like 50 plus feet high, and had zero signs of life when we ended up getting there. Even though there was plenty of people around. I mean, is that and he fell right on some rock or ledge. I'm not sure if that's the same category as major blunt trauma. I would think so, even
Right.
though CPR was still done.
So
I don't know at what point it's.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So we have a serious mechanism of injury. We have a fall from great height, right? And we don't know if he was wearing protective equipment, but there's really only so much damage a human body can take. But there is a lot of damage the human body can take and still survive. And so when we arrive to that person, first we have to check for unresponsive, not breathing, no pulse, no brain activity in terms of responsive pupils, and the absence of heart sounds. So not only do we not feel a pulse, but we actually listen to the heart, or even maybe connect them to a heart monitor and see that their heart is not beating, right? And all 5 of those things must be present, plus one of these factors. And so when you arrived on scene, was he decapitated? Was his head caved in? Was there just a sort of significant reshaping of his body because of that blunt trauma?
Gotcha. Yeah. No, I mean, in that specific case, it not that I want to get into detail, but
Mm-hmm.
Blood coming from the ears and eyes, I think, as well. So it wasn't like deformities or anything like that, but you could tell like quite a few bones are broken, and and then blood coming from places that probably shouldn't have be coming from.
Right. And so what I sort of approach the subject in an irreverent and cavalier manner, but it is a very important subject, and we as sort of the front lines of emergency medicine are likely to be exposed to dead and dying people in the field, right? So if you run enough calls, this will be something that you interface with. So at the EMR level, and I would say even at the EMT level, your best option is to get someone with a higher level of certification on scene. So in that case, I would say that you probably had most or all of the signs of death, but it would be very, very difficult for you to determine one of the factors of death. And so therefore, that person is still viable for resuscitation. Now, you get a wilderness paramedic or a wilderness doc on there. I assume this is in sort of a remote environment. You had to hike in and get this guy maybe. But in any case, get someone there with a deeper understanding of anatomy and physiology who can make the determination, yes, this person has broken their body, and this is not something that would be viable for resuscitation. Or give it the old college try for 20 minutes as required by a protocol, and then terminate the resuscitation on scene. Again, these are things that are not going to be these are things that is better to sort of put onto the shoulders of people with a higher level of certification and training, right? And so the next thing we'll talk about is termination of resuscitation. So the first thing that we see here, sort of under our green protocols here, and so we as EMRs will sort of fall in this green area for the most part. There are certain things that EMTs can do that we can't do as EMRs, but generally speaking, the physical skills that we find in this green section are going to be where we fall in the protocol. And so, this is all stuff we can do, right? We're keeping an eye on scene safety. We're keeping an eye on our team. So if in the case of that wilderness rescue, right? So you are hiking into the wilderness, you have limited resources. You have what you find and what you bring, and that is it. Right? And there's a significant lag time for additional resources to arrive on scene. If everyone in your crew becomes exhausted, right, there's not going to be a good outcome from that. So you have to maintain your awareness and understand that if you hiked in, you also have to hike out. So if you completely exhaust yourself, now you become the patient, and you should never compete with your patient for care. And then the other thing that we see here is the AED has advised no shock for 20 minutes. And that's sort of a statewide rule. So you give it the old college try, you do the best CPR you can, you deliver those shocks, you do everything you can in a high performance manner for at least 20 minutes. At which point, if you don't have a paramedic there, if it's more than 20 minutes to a hospital, or if any of these other factors are in play, then you'll terminate resuscitation. And then the last line here, if directed to do so by medical control, if you find yourself in the situation where you're just not comfortable, right? You're doing CPR, you don't know whether you should terminate, you don't know whether there's factors and signs of death, you don't know. Call for medical control. It is never a bad idea to ask for help, right? And so that would be my advice to you when it comes to when to start and when to stop CPR. So any questions on all this? So Dustin in the chat said internal bleeding. You don't know about internal bleeding unless you have a CAT scan or an ultrasound, and you know how to use them really, really well. You're not going to find internal bleeding because, again, it is internal. So we're not concerned about that. However, there are some external signs, which are shock. And so we covered shock a little bit, and we'll talk more about shock throughout the course.
Hey, Max, can any higher level of medical professional tell you to stop, or can only med control tell you to stop, like, treatment?
Yeah, that's a good question.
You as a paramedic could tell me to stop, or no?
So a paramedic is going to tell you to do things like stop compressions so that they can look at the heart rhythm on their cardiac monitors. Or they're going to, they're one of the first things you do in cardiac arrest is you notify dispatch to get additional resources. And then dispatch is going to start a timer for you. And so at 20 minutes, dispatch will tell you it's been 20 minutes. And at that point, a paramedic may say something like, all right, is there anything that we haven't considered, right? Is there any reversible causes that we haven't treated? And this is advanced cardiovascular life support that they're referencing. And if the answer is no, if they've considered all the reversible causes and they've done all the treatments that they can do as an advanced life support provider, then they're going to call it or terminate resuscitation, right? And so at that point, they'll also tell you to stop. And again, CPR is a team sport, right? So it's not just going to be you providing compressions. It's not going to be just you delivering shocks. It's going to be, hopefully, a lot of people. And we all have a voice when it comes to resuscitation. And so if you're uncomfortable with something, if you think that there's something that hasn't been done yet, then that would be the time to speak up and say, hey, I don't think we've checked the blood sugar. I don't think we've considered, possible drug overdose, or whatever, you think is going on. So does that answer the question?
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks.
Cool. I like over-explaining things. Okay, so I think we've beat this horse. Yep, chest compressions. This is all stuff that you would have learned in your CPR class, 1 and 2 rescuers. Now, answer me this. What is the chest compression rate for an adult? Anyone?
30-2.
That's the ratio of compressions to ventilations. But what is the rate at which you would do compressions?
100 to 120.
Between 100 and 120 compressions per minute, right? And so what I recommend EMS providers have on hand is some kind of metronome. And so when we do high performance CPR, when we meet up again in the lab, I'm going to have a metronome out, and it will be ticking away at 110 beats per minute. Not too fast, not too slow, just right. And I recommend that you do the same. Now, all right, this might be a trick question. What is the rate of compressions? So same question. What is the rate of compressions for an infant?
100 to 120.
Same rate, right? Exactly the same rate. Okay, so we talked about the ratio of compressions to ventilations for an adult and for a child being what? So compression to ventilation ratio. What is it?
30 to 2.
30 to 2. All right. So for an infant, for a single person on an infant, what is the ratio?
15 to
30-2.
For one person, it's still 30 to 2. When does it switch to 15 to 2?
2 people.
Exactly. All right. And that's the big thing. Listen, I've seen paramedics, nurses, physicians mess that up, right? Because we're used to doing 30 to 2, and then we switch over to that 2 rescuer, and then all of a sudden the counting changes. So just keep that in mind. All right, so let's forge ahead boldly. I'm going to hit the summary. All right, so again, cardiac arrest. The circulatory system transports oxygenated bloods from the lungs to the rest of the body. Each beat of the heart produces a pulse, which can be felt throughout the body. And the most common places that we're going to check are the inside of the wrist, which is the radial, the neck, which is the carotid, and for children, we'll check the upper arm, which is the brachial. Cardiac arrest occurs when the heart stops contracting and blood is no longer pumped through the blood vessels. And remember that brain damage begins within about 4 to 6 minutes, and permanent brain damage will start between 8 to 10 minutes. And again, this is permanent damage that will affect their quality of life if they survive. So how are we going to get them to survive? We're going to initiate this chain of survival: recognition, activation of EMS, immediate high-quality CPR, defibrillation as soon as possible, advanced life support as soon as possible, and getting them to the hospital where they can be appropriately resuscitated and given supportive care. When you arrive in an emergency scene, you have to first assess the area for potential safety hazards. Nothing new there. And if the scene is unsafe, you have to make it as safe as possible for yourself, your crew, and then the patients and any bystanders. As you approach the patients, you're looking for possible illness or injury, and then you're going to do your primary assessment, just like we taught you. But of course, we have an emphasis on early chest compression, so circulation, airway breathing. If the patient's not breathing, you have to breathe for them. If they don't have a pulse, you have to begin CPR. Basic life support for adults and children follows the same basic steps. We check for responsiveness. We open the airway, look, listen, and feel, while simultaneously checking for a pulse. We intervene at any point where the patient's airway is obstructed, if the patient's not breathing or the patient has no circulation. So remember, if the airway is obstructed and we can see the thing that is blocking their airway, we can absolutely take it out. But if we can't see it, we're not going to just shove our fingers in this person's throat and potentially make the obstruction worse. We open an infant's airway by using the head tilt chin lift if we don't suspect any spinal injury. Be careful not to hyperextend the neck in the little babies, because you can actually overextend and then kink their airway shut because their airway is smaller and more flexible. Remember that we only provide enough breath in the infant to produce a chest rise and fall. Remember, we don't want to inflate the baby. We want to ventilate. And you can cause some significant lung injury and damage if you put an adult-sized lung volume into the baby's lungs. The single most important cardiac arrest survival factor is early defibrillation. Provided that you're doing good chest compressions, the greatest increase in survival is going to be with that early defibrillation. And this is all stuff that you should have learned in your CPR course. So remember that we turn the AED on first, and then it will tell us what it wants us to do. So attach pads, analyzing rhythm, don't touch the patient, and we'll get lots of experience with this when we meet up again. So again, let's do some review questions and we'll move on to airway. Which of these patients is in cardiac arrest? A patient who is in cardiac arrest does not require rescue breathing, does not have a pulse and is not breathing, should be considered dead after 10 minutes of CPR, or requires treatment that is beyond the scope of practice of the EMR. And so I've got a bunch of B's in the chat. Does anyone disagree with B? All right. No trick questions here. All right. The majority of out-of-hospital cardiac arrest patients have an irregular heart electrical rhythm called ventricular fibrillation. How would you characterize this rhythm? Is it rapid, disorganized, and ineffective? Slow, disorganized, and ineffective? Rapid, but effective, or no electrical activity at all? This is a little bit of a trick question because you're not going to have access to a cardiac monitor, so you're not really going to know whether it's fast or slow. But it is, in fact, fast. So it's a rapid, disorganized, and ineffective heartbeat. And just to give you an idea, just in case you've never actually opened up someone's chest who was in the state of ventricular fibrillation, I know some of us haven't done that. If you were to look at the heart when it's in ventricular fibrillation, it actually looks like a bag of worms. It's just sort of like crawling around. The skin is twitching, right? So yeah, I will show the question again. So it's this rapid, quivering, twitching heart muscle, and it's not squishing, it's not beating in order to produce that pulse that forces the blood out to the rest of the body. It's just sort of wiggling in place. And you can have something called atrial fibrillation or AFib. This is a common condition that you'll see in older folks. And that's just where the top parts of the heart are doing the same thing, but the bottom parts are squeezing. Ventricular fibrillation is where the bottom parts are doing that. And the bottom part is the ventricles are the pump of the heart. And so if they're just quivering around that rapid, irregular, ineffective heartbeat, then you're not producing a pulse, you're not getting the blood out. So that is what ventricular fibrillation is: rapid, disorganized, and ineffective. All right, which of the following is not, gotta love these negative questions here, which of the following is not a sign of effective CPR? So compressions are delivered at a rate of 50 per minute. You can feel a carotid pulse during chest compressions. The patient's color turns pink from blue, and the chest visibly rises during ventilations. So which of these things is terrible? Yep, yep. Just like Fonzie said, "Ay." That's right. Okay, another really terribly old reference. Yes, so what is the correct rate of compressions? We said it before. Say it again. Correct rate. That's right, 100 to 120. All right, so let's jump into the airway management slides. Before we kick that off, does anyone have any questions about CPR at the healthcare provider level? Brian, what you got?
I was just curious. So when you go to 2 rescuer, it turns to 15 to 2, but single person, like for adults, 30 to 2. Why is that? Is that because of like effectiveness wise? I'm just having more people to like give the best you can, or is there some other reason?
So I think we have some wires crossed here. When we go from a 1 rescuer to a 2 rescuer CPR in an adult or a child, do we change the compression to ventilation ratio? Anyone?
The adult, no, but the child, yes.
For
The
an
child-
infant. For an infant. Right. So when we switch from 1 rescuer to 2 rescuer CPR in an infant, we switch from a rate of 30 to 2 to a rate of 15 to 2. Right. And to answer your question specifically, and this is only in infants that we do this, only in children less than 1 year of age. We do it in infants because, and I'll ask this as a question, when infants go into cardiac arrest, is it because they have significant heart disease, or is it another reason?
Usually a blockage, isn't it?
A blockage of what?
Airway. Of their airway.
Yes, absolutely. It is respiratory driven. So if we do 15 compressions and then we give 2 breaths, and we do another 15 compressions and we do 2 breaths, what are they getting more of as compared to
Oxygen.
adults and children, right? We're ventilating more. And so because their cardiac arrest is respiratory driven, we're actually emphasizing respirations. Now, the reason why we still do 30 to 2 with a single rescuer is it's thought that it takes too much time to transition between compressions and ventilations when there's just one of you, right? And so once we have 2 rescuers and we can synchronize our efforts between giving the compressions and 15, 1 breath, 2 breath, back to compressions, then all of a sudden it gets easier to successfully resuscitate, or at least that's the thinking. Does that answer the question and clarify things?
Yes, thank you.
Perfect. And again, that 15 to 2 thing trips everybody up. It's not, it's not just EMRs and EMTs, it's nurses, physicians, paramedics. A lot of people get tripped up by that.
Matt,
Yes, sir.
question. Page 155 of the book.
Mm-hmm.
This is under child CPR. Coordinate chest compressions and ventilations. 30 to 2 ratio for 1 rescuer and 15 to 2 for 2 rescuer.
Okay. That's not the AHA standard. So that's a disagreement between the textbook and the American Heart Association. What I'd recommend is stick with the guidelines provided by the agency that certified you to do CPR. And if they're following the modern International Consortium on Resuscitation guidelines, then it's only the infants. Which, of course, I mean, that's been the case since 2015, so I don't know why a textbook published in 2018 would say that. But we will forge on. All right, so let's dig into airway management for about 15 minutes, and I'll cut you guys on another break. This is a big topic. This is a huge topic, and airway management is one of the most anxiety-producing conditions for rescuers, not even just for patients. This produces anxiety in the people responding to the folks who need airway management. And so we're going to spend a bit of time on this. We're really going to dig into some of these topics, and we're going to practice these skills a lot in the next lab. So again, airway management, respiration, and artificial ventilation. You'll see this abbreviated as ARV in a lot of the education topics. I encourage you, if you have any questions about what you need to know, check out the National EMS Education Standards. And I threw this chart in here because for most of the things that we're learning at the EMR level, we have a small depth and small breadth of information. We keep it pretty light, right? We don't go into a whole lot of detail. We cover each of these topics in sort of a very brief manner. Airway ventilation, airway management, respiration, artificial ventilation is one of the few things in the EMR curriculum where we turn the volume up a little bit. And so you can see that we have sort of this medium breadth, medium depth that we're approaching the EMT level of skill and knowledge. And so that will sort of demonstrate to you how important this set of skills is. And so we're going to talk about specifically the anatomy of the airway, how to assess the airway, how to make sure that the airway is open or patent. Patent is the term we use for opening the airway. So make sure that the airway is patent. We're going to talk about the anatomy of the respiratory system, so the lungs, the actual place where oxygen exchanges, and then some of the function and dysfunction, or physiology and pathophysiology, because anytime you put patho in front of a word, it breaks it, right? And so physiology and pathophysiology of respiration, including the movement of air, the movement of oxygen, and then what that oxygen does throughout the body. And then we're going to talk about what is adequate and how can you tell, and what is inadequate and how can you tell, right? And that's a really important distinction to be able to make when you're on scene with a patient, right? And then what are we going to do about it? So in a lot of cases, it means providing additional oxygen therapy. And so again, this is going to be a skill set that you're going to be very, very good at by the end of this course. And then we're going to get into what's called artificial ventilation. This is basically breathing for the patient using a device called a bag valve mask, and we'll get into what that looks like. And so we're going to talk about how to use a bag valve mask. How fast should you bag them? How much air should you deliver into their body? And then we're going to translate that knowledge into concepts of shock physiology and recognizing a variety of medical complaints and respiratory complaints, and we're going to get into some diseases. So it's going to be a fun night, and we're going to cover a lot of ground. So two of the most important life-saving skills that you're going to give or to get here is how to open an airway and how to breathe for someone, right? Because apart from giving them a heartbeat, these are going to give you the most dividends when it comes to saving a life. And again, don't let anyone diminish your role as an EMR, because if you arrive on scene first, regardless of whether there's an ambulance there, and you're able to open an airway and deliver effective ventilations, you've just saved a life, right? And the paramedics and the EMTs and the nurses and the physicians, they weren't there. They didn't save the life. You saved the life. And so again, going back to the idea that the fate of the wounded lies with the person to apply the first treatment, that's you. And how are you going to do that? Open the airway and provide rescue breathing. So patients have to have an open airway, and they have to maintain adequate breathing in order to survive. So by using simple skills, you can often make the difference between life and death. And so again, the ABCs of life-saving: airway, breathing, and circulation. Remember to check and correct airway and breathing before you move on to any sort of secondary assessment or history taking. And so let's dig into the anatomy and physiology of this respiratory system. So to maintain life, all humans, and in fact, pretty much every organism with more than one cell, needs to have some source of food, some source of water, and oxygen. A lack of oxygen, even for a few minutes, can result in, again, irreversible damage and potentially death, right? If not to the entire organism, then to at least some of the organism, the brain, the kidneys, the guts, other organisms, or I'm sorry, organ systems. If brain cells are deprived from of oxygen and nutrients for 4 to 6 minutes, they shut down and start to die. And then brain death is followed by death of the entire body. The main purpose of the respiratory system is to provide oxygen and then to remove the waste products of metabolism like carbon dioxide and other things like that. And they do that through the use of red blood cells like we talked about. So here we see a diagram of the parts of the body used in breathing. So we have sort of this upper group of passages called the pharynx, right? And so we have the oropharynx and the nasopharynx. And basically oro is like mouth, think oral, the oral cavity, and naso sounds like nostril or nose, right? And so nasopharynx, oropharynx, and then the place where they connect in the back of your throat, the place where they push the swabs during the COVID test, all the way back there, that's the pharynx, right? And so we have the nose, the mouth, and then where they connect in the back. Now, this goes down, there's a flap called the epiglottis, and this is just a flap of skin that covers up your windpipe so that when you swallow, you don't get food and drink in there. And we'll talk more about the epiglottis later on. This leads down into your larynx, and the larynx is where your voice box is. These are where your vocal cords are. This is how you make sound when you talk. And so this is the top of the trachea or the windpipe. Now the trachea is what you feel in the front of your neck. It's that hard ringed structure. You'll notice that as you move your fingers up and down, there are some rings, right? And each of these rings are rings of cartilage that sort of keep your airway open at all times. Your airway, as opposed to like your esophagus, you know, the pipe that goes down to your stomach, the food pipe collapses and stays shut so that you don't just vomit all the time. Whereas your windpipe stays open. It never collapses unless you get like throat punched or something. And so eventually your windpipe goes all the way down to where it splits off into two and feeds each lung. And then the airway passages in each lung, they get smaller and smaller and smaller. They branch off and branch off and branch off. And they look like a big tree, like a bush or something, until they get down to the very, very smallest part, which is known as the alveoli. And alveoli look like, they look in this picture like clusters of grapes. But if you've ever gone hunting or butchered an animal, then you'll know that the lung tissue looks like a sponge. It looks like a kitchen sponge. And all of these tiny, tiny airway areas, the area where gas exchange takes place, they're all packed into the tissue of your lung. And so if you were to cut open a lung, it would look just like a sponge. And so what's so important about these alveoli? Well, the membrane, the thickness of those alveoli is 1 cell thick, right? So you have one layer of cells, and the gas on the inside of the alveoli is separated from the blood coming from your heart by that one cell. And so what happens is that this allows the relatively high concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere to cross over into the relatively low concentration of oxygen in the blood coming from your heart. And so in this way, we're able to load up those blood cells with lots of oxygen molecules. And at the same time, there's a lot of dissolved carbon dioxide in your blood. It's actually in the form of carbonic acid, which is why sometimes you'll hear higher level medical providers talking about how a patient is acidotic or their blood is acidic. when carbon dioxide comes in contact with the water that is half of your blood volume, it creates something called carbonic acid. This is the same reason why CO2 in the atmosphere acidifies the oceans. It's just a basic chemical reaction that creates an acid. And so what happens is that in the lungs, that process reverses and the CO2 comes out of solution, goes into your lungs, and when you exhale a bunch of CO2. And that's the chemistry behind why we breathe. We take on oxygen and we release carbon dioxide in order to feed our body's cells with the things it needs to produce energy and to get rid of a lot of the metabolic waste products of energy metabolism. And so you also see here this pink structure down here. This is your diaphragm. And the diaphragm is a big parachute-shaped muscle. And when the muscle contracts, it flattens out. And because the chest is a rigid, fixed container, what do you expect happens to the pressure inside the chest when that muscle pulls down and flattens out? What goes on inside the chest when the diaphragm flattens out, when you breathe in?
Basically, the suction.
What was that again?
I was going to say it kind of creates a suction and pulls air in as the diaphragm contracts.
Yeah, I like that. I like that idea. So suction. So there's actually, and this is a little bit academic, but there's no such thing as suction. You're creating a negative pressure inside the chest, and all of a sudden the air comes rushing in through your nose and mouth in order to backfill that pressure. And so what's that?
Oh, sorry. I literally was thinking. I don't know why I said suction because I
You're absolutely right.
Water
right?
sports on the fire truck.
because I mean, like, so you're when you drink from a straw, we call it sucking it up through the straw, right? That's effectively what you're doing, is you're creating negative pressure, and you do the same thing in your chest. And so the reason why breathing works is, first off, we have ribs, which are great. And ribs hold our chest in the shape that it's supposed to be. And then when that parachute-shaped diaphragm pulls down, it expands the chest cavity, creating that negative pressure. And then, effectively what you're doing is you're sucking air in through your nose and mouth to fill that negative pressure inside your chest. And fortunately, the way everything is set up, when we pull that diaphragm down, when we take a deep breath, it's all these alveoli, sacs that are filling up with air and replacing the oxygen that we're using in our body. So exactly. And so to support that, we have numerous chest muscles. So you can see that we have muscles in between each rib here. We also have muscles up by our collarbones. We have muscles down in our abdominal region. We have the big muscle of the diaphragm. And all of these muscles work in conjunction to increase the area inside your chest when you breathe in. And that's going to be an important little fact for later. So what is the number one cause of airway blockage in an unconscious person?
The tongue being in
Tongue.
Exactly, the tongue.
Sorry, Bernard.
Absolutely, the tongue. And so when you're unconscious, you can't really keep your tongue in the front of your mouth, and gravity is eventually going to cause that big slug of muscle to slide back into your throat, and you're going to start choking on your own tongue, right? And this is one of the reasons why, if anyone here has experience with a loved one who snores, you'll find that a good elbow to the rib cage when they're laying on their back causes them to roll over on their side, and then all of a sudden the tongue slides out of the back of their throat and they're no longer snoring. Pro tip there. And this is the principle behind the recovery position. If you'll remember from our first lecture, we're rolling them on their side, we're getting that tongue out of the way so that they can breathe well again. Now, when we're treating our patient, we're obviously not going to roll them on their sides, and we're certainly not going to elbow them in the ribs to get them to breathe better. But we are going to use airway maneuvers like the head tilt chin lift and the jaw thrust in order to get that tongue up off the back of the throat. Now, in addition to this, we have a couple other things that we can use to get that big meat wad off the back of their throat. And these are going to be airway adjuncts, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. But you can see here from the illustration, meat wad sitting on the back of the throat, you pull the jaw forward, meat wad no longer make for bad breathing. All right, so other parts of the respiratory system. So again, at the back of the throat, we have the two passages. We have first the esophagus, which is the tube through which food passes. And this is, again, this is a flexible sleeve of muscle that is most of the time relaxed. Sometimes, well, when you swallow, certainly it squeezes the food down. Fun fact, it takes about 7 seconds from the time you swallow to the time the food gets into your stomach. And next time you take a swallow of a really cold drink, you can actually feel it going down your esophagus if you focus on it. And that's because the muscles of the esophagus are squeezing sort of in sequence to push that stuff down. And then likewise, when your stomach decides that it doesn't like whatever it is that you just swallowed, this series of muscles can suddenly work in the opposite direction to ruin your sweater and your carpet. That's vomiting I'm talking about. And then we'll talk more about vomiting when we get to suction, because vomiting, again, not great for the process of breathing, and certainly not great if it gets inside your lungs. So covering the top of that so that we don't put food into our lungs is that little flapper valve called the epiglottis. And this, again, when your trachea, or I'm sorry, when your voice box, so your Adam's apple in men. Now, women also have that same structure. It's just not as prominent. When that's in the full up position, this flap is up. And so your epiglottis is open. You can talk incessantly if you're me, and everything is hunky-dory. And so that when you activate swallowing, you'll notice that this structure goes up and down. And so when it moves, it mechanically pushes that flap down over the top of your windpipe and prevents you from inhaling whatever it is that you're eating or drinking. Below the trachea, airway divides into bronchi. Again, the two large tubes supported by cartilage, and then it feeds into the lungs located either side of the heart. Now, you have less lung on your left side because part of that is occupied by your heart. And so, and we'll get into sort of the mechanics of that in a little bit. Smaller airways. So again, some vocabulary here. The bronchi split into bronchioles, right? And this is a convention that you see elsewhere. So like arteries go into arterioles, bronchi go into bronchioles. And you can remember that these structures are called bronchi because we'll talk a little later about bronchitis, which is an inflammation of the bronchi, right? So again, we're getting some of this Greek and Latin that Dave talked about. Itis refers to anything that is inflamed. If you have an itis of something, you can be rest assured that it is inflamed in some way, right? So an itis of the bronchi, bronchitis. And so the actual gas exchange, again, takes place across that thin membrane that separates the capillaries from the circulatory system in the alveoli. The process of gas exchange is called alveolar ventilation. Again, a little bit of medical terminology here, but if you break that down, alveolar ventilation, that's ventilation that occurs inside the alveoli. And so you can sort of break down these words and figure out what they mean just by knowing their components. And so when the patient's not breathing, artificial ventilation is required to supply oxygen to the heart and the rest of the body. And that's a little bit of a misnomer because it's not just them not breathing, it's them not breathing enough to sustain life, right? So remember, what is the respiratory rate for a normal adult human being?
12 to 20.
12 to 20. So if they're breathing 6 times a minute, or if they're breathing 30 times a minute, but it's really shallow, is this going to be sufficient to sustain life?
I don't know.
And the answer is not for long. Right? They're getting a little bit of gas exchange, but they're going to run out eventually, and we want to fix whatever is causing that problem. So I'm going to take a pause here. Let's take another 10-minute break. So come on back at 8:15, and we'll dig into more of this anatomy and physiology and nerdy respiratory stuff. So take 10. So here we have an illustration of the alveoli, which is, again, the terminal end of the airway passage. So we can see that each one of these air sacs is wrapped with a capillary bed. And so remember that capillaries are the smallest blood vessels carrying blood. And so as a blood cell passes by the alveoli, as it sort of swings around these air sacs, it's slowly picking up the oxygen that's inside the alveoli, and then dropping off the CO2 that's dissolved in the blood and the plasma. And then by the time it exits this loop and starts draining back into the heart, it is fully oxygenated in most healthy people. And so this is that process of oxygenation and gas exchange. So lungs consist of soft, spongy tissue with no muscles. This is the lung tissue itself. However, if we go back to this illustration, you see that these pink bands that are surrounding the airway passages are actually smooth muscle, which is your involuntary muscle inside your body. And so that will be, that's something that we focus on with some diseases such as asthma and things like that. But for the rest of the tissue, the actual alveoli themselves, there's no muscle tissue in the alveoli. Movement of air in the lungs depends on movement of the rib cage and the diaphragm, just like we talked about. That diaphragm pulls down during inhalation, flattens out, moves downward, and that creates a bigger negative pressure space inside the chest cavity. And so here we see that when the diaphragm is relaxed, it's sort of pulled up into this parachute position, and it actually goes quite high up into your chest. And then when you take a deep breath in, you're contracting that muscle voluntarily and pulling it down, which caused you to take that deep breath. All right, so A is for airway. We know that in healthy individuals, the airway automatically stays open, right? However, if you were to go deeply unconscious, an injured or seriously ill person may not be able to activate sort of the voluntary processes that keep the airway open. So they're not going to be able to keep their tongue off the back of their throat and things like that. And so this is why we have to continue to check the condition of the patient's airway and correct any problems that may wind up so that we can keep the patient alive. And so how do we do this? Well, just like we practiced last weekend, you start off by doing simple maneuvers to check for responsiveness. So we determine whether the patient's responsive or unresponsive by introducing yourself. Hi, my name's Max. I'm an EMR. How are we doing today? Hey, can you hear me? Things like that. And if they respond to you, then we know that they're responsive to verbal stimuli, which is a good place to start. If we can't get a response, then we can start gently shaking the patient's shoulders, repeating questions, or provide noxious stimuli like a sternal rub or something like that. And again, we're not trying to make the patient suffer. We're not trying to inflict pain on them. We're simply trying to see if they can respond to some sort of noxious physical stimuli. If the patient's completely unconscious, then what we're going to do is get additional resources on the way, right? Being completely unconscious is not normal for any person. They should be arousable. Once you get help on the way, we can position the patient by supporting the patient's head and neck. If they're not on their back already and we don't suspect spinal trauma, then we can roll them over onto their back. Once they're on their back, we're going to open a patient's airway either using a head tilt chin lift, or if we suspect spinal trauma, if we are considering C-spine and we suspect that it's important, then we can use a jaw thrust. So in order to do the head tilt chin lift, again, as the name implies, we put one hand on the forehead, 2 fingers under the chin, we tilt the head back, and we pull the chin up. One thing that I've seen is what I call the head tilt chin smash, which is where you push the head back and then you push the chin down towards the rest of their body. And if you're pushing their chin down, what do you think is going to happen to their airway?
And soon close up.
Close up.
Right, exactly. You're going to collapse their airway. And so I've seen this a lot with folks responding to things like overdoses, right? You have a patient who's not breathing on their own and they need their airway opened up. And so instead of getting down and doing a head tilt chin lift, they just sort of open the mouth and place a mask over the top. And that is not actually opening the airway. And so that's a failure to manage the airway. All right, one moment.
If you're doing the head lift and chin lift and you find that the tongue is a choking hazard, like can those two conflict with each other at some point? And if so, what's the best thing?
Yeah, okay. So the question is, does the tongue ever present an issue when you're opening the airway, either with the head tilt, chin lift, or the jaw thrust? And the answer is, if the tongue is swollen, then the tongue can block the airway. What you're doing with the head tilt chin lift, because you're lifting that chin, you're lifting the tongue off the back of the throat. So hopefully, if their nasopharynx is open, they'll get air in through their nose when they start breathing. If not, then we have other airway adjuncts that we'll talk about in just a little bit that we can put in the patient's nose or mouth in order to open that airway up. Does that answer the question?
That answers the question for the most part. Thank you.
Okay. And we'll get a little bit more practice with this as we get our hands on these mannequins. So again, the jaw thrust maneuver. If you suspect any cervical spine problems, any trauma to their cervical spine, then manipulating their neck in that head tilt chin lift is going to potentially induce motion into broken bones, and we don't want that. And so in that case, we can keep the head still and just lift the chin, right? And this is called the jaw thrust maneuver. And so what we're going to do is we're going to place our fingers behind the angle of the jaw, and we're just going to pull that forward. So not necessarily dislocating their jaw, but pretty much every person is able to move their jaw in and out. And what we're doing is we're just moving that jaw forward, sort of pushing out their lower teeth. And this does require a bit of force. This is not something that is easy to do. There's a lot of muscles in your jaw that want to keep it in position. And then one of the things about this picture that I don't necessarily like is the thumbs are pointing down towards the chin. A lot of times what I will do is I'll put the thumbs right on the top of their cheekbone and just sort of squeeze my fingers and my thumbs together, and that will also help you pull that jaw up off the back of their throat. And so we'll get more practice with this in the skills lab. And so this here is an animation that I added in. This is an MRI, or a magnetic resonance image of someone moving their head back and forth. And you can see that there is the tongue right here. And you can see sort of how the airway constricts and opens up as we manipulate their cervical spine. And so we can see the bones of their neck, we can see their spinal cord here, we can see their nasopharynx, their oropharynx, which is closed because their mouth is shut, and then the diameter of their airway and how it gets bigger and smaller. And so this little flappy do right here, that is their epiglottis, and it is up right now because they're not swallowing anything. Right? And so that gives you an idea of what you're doing internally when you're doing these head tilt chin lifts, and how important it is to actually get that chin up in the air, right? If we push that chin down, even if the head is tilted back, then we're really not doing what we think we're doing. All right, so once we get the airway open, we want to check for fluids, foreign bodies, dentures, broken off teeth, really anything in the airway that isn't their tongue that's going to slide back and obstruct the airway. So potential block secretions like vomit, drool, mucus, blood, foreign objects like candy, food, dirt, dentures, false teeth. If you find anything in the patient's mouth, you can just remove it. If you can see it, you can take it out. What we don't want to do is what's called blind finger sweeps. So we don't just jam our fingers in someone's mouth because we think their airway is obstructed. What we have found, thanks to science, is that when we do that, if there is something in their mouth, we tend to push it further down in their throat and make it, if it was a partial obstruction, we could potentially make it a complete obstruction, which is definitely not good for the patient's breathing. And then if the patient's mouth is clear, consider using one of the devices described in the section on airway devices, which we will get to shortly. So again, finger sweeps, this is very, very quick maneuver. If you can see it and if you think you can get it out of their mouth, all you have to do is sweep in there with your finger. Now keep in mind, don't put anything in a patient's mouth that you don't want bitten off. I try to keep my fingers out of people's mouths as much as I can, just as a general life rule. And then I happen to have special tools that I can use to sort of fish into a person's airway if need be. However, that said, if there is something threatening their life, obstructing their airway, like a big old chunk of steak or something, and I can see it and I can take it out, then I'm absolutely going to go in there. I do know my camera is off. I will turn it on for you. There we go. Okay, and then suctioning. So we have mechanical suction. This is a device that produces negative pressure. So it's a vacuum pump. It is a canister that the vacuum pump is attached to, and then a long section of tubing that you can use to suction up vomit, blood, mucus, or other things in the patient's mouth. And so again, this is going to be something that we will get hands-on practice with next time we're in the skills lab. So I have suction devices for all the labs. So there's a few different types of suction. There is mechanical suction, and these are hand-operated devices where you'll physically pump the suction bulb or pump a handle, and they will draw whatever is in their mouth up into a bag. Not super efficient, a little bit difficult to use because you also have to move the nozzle around the patient's mouth when you're doing this. Alternatively, there are other motorized suction devices that you can switch on. For example, this is very similar to what we'll be using in class. This is a battery-operated suction device, and you'll turn this on and it will produce all of the negative pressure you'll need, and you can just focus on moving the suction catheter around the person's mouth and suctioning up. So some general rules that you'll want to remember. Don't apply suction inside someone's mouth for more than 15 seconds, right? And generally speaking, you don't want to suction deeper than you can see. So you're going to insert the catheter into the patient's mouth with either the suction turned off, either clamped or just deactivated, or some catheters will have a hole that you need to cover with your finger in order for the suction to be applied into the mouth, right? You need to familiarize yourself with whatever equipment your department has, but you're going to go in without suction applied, and then you're going to apply suction, and then on your way out, as you move around the patient's mouth and suck up whatever you can, no more than 15 seconds at a time. So, question in the chat, what if someone has dentures and they are held in by adhesive? So generally speaking, if you don't have false teeth, generally speaking, false teeth are held on by some kind of adhesive so that you can chew and your dentures don't just fall out. Not everyone, but most folks with dentures will have some sort of adhesive. If the dentures are in place, if they are not moving around, if they are not becoming an obstruction, you need to leave them in the patient's face because teeth provide structure for the face. And if someone has fake teeth and you remove them, all of a sudden a part of their face that was firm and providing structure to masks and airway adjuncts and things like that is now just soft gums, right? And now the part of the face that's important for airway is destabilized. So if it's not an obstruction, if it's not causing a problem, don't remove it. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. So someone asked, why 15 seconds? So generally, the longer you apply suction, the more you are actually removing air from the airway. You're creating a negative pressure in the nose and mouth, right? And so the thought is, again, this is sort of hypothetical. The thought is that the longer you apply suction, the more you steal air from the patient's lungs. Whether or not this is actually true is to be determined. But generally speaking, I will suction for around 10 seconds, personal preference. And if you're using good technique and you're using the right catheter with a well-functioning mechanical suction device, you're going to get everything you need out of that patient's mouth in 10 seconds. Now, having said that, there are certain advanced techniques that paramedics and physicians can do where they place suction inside someone's mouth and then just leave it there while they're doing other airway skills. And this is called airway decontamination. This is like if someone is actively bleeding or actively throwing up and you need to manage their airway more definitively. So the explanation that if you suction for more than 15 seconds, you're stealing air from the patient's lungs doesn't really check out. But for the purposes of this certification and these tests and what you're expected to do in the field, do not suction for more than 15 seconds at a time. And as you gain more medical knowledge, you will learn the exceptions to that rule. All right, so for maintaining the airway, I want you to think of the airway like a door. Like one of those doors that are spring-loaded, that it automatically closes on you. So you open up the door, you walk through, and as soon as you let go of the door handle, what happens to the door? I can see people, I can see people's mouths moving. Yes, it closes. So you find a patient unconscious laying on the floor, and you open their airway using the head tilt chin lift, and then you let go. What happens to the airway? It closes. Yes, very good. And so we need to maintain that airway open. And so what do we have? What sorts of things do we have to keep this door open once we open it?
Adjuncts.
What's that?
Air adjuncts.
Like a door stop, like those little wedges that you like cram underneath the door, or anything like that. So in order to keep the door open, we have to put some sort of door stop in there. And usually they're mechanical devices. We'll call them door adjuncts. You know, there's a mechanical device that you insert underneath the door and it keeps the door open. All right. We're going to do the same thing with an airway. We have these airway adjuncts that we're going to put into the patient's nose and mouth in order to keep that airway open once we have already opened it using another maneuver. All right. So it's important to remember that sequence of events. And so one of the first adjuncts that we can use is gravity, right? And we talked about this before. Recovery position. If you have an unconscious patient, they don't have any active trauma or medicine issues, and you need to go on to provide care for other patients, we can put them in this recovery position. Gravity keeps the patient's tongue and lower jaw from blocking their airway. It allows for drainage of secretions. Fantastic. All right. Now, this isn't always possible to put the patient like this, and it's certainly not something we're going to do if we're actively caring for the patient. But again, it's an option, especially in low resource or mass casualty environments. The next thing that we're going to look at is what's called the oral airway, or an OPA, or an oropharyngeal airway. And this is it looks like an upside down question mark. And this has two primary purposes. First, it maintains the patient's airway by pulling the tongue up from the back of the throat. And this will make more sense when we get into the lab and start inserting these things. It also serves as a pathway to get a suction catheter into their mouth. So some of these will have holes down the center that we can put in a suction catheter. Some of them will just act as bite blocks in case the patient is biting down, and we can get in there and do some suctioning. So here's the thing with the oropharyngeal airway. Can anyone tell me, in their experience, what happens when you take a finger and you push it deep, deep down into the back of your throat? Is there something that occurs?
Puke. Gag reflex.
Your gag reflex, exactly. This is a protective mechanism that we have developed over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution to make sure that things don't fall down into our throat and choke us to death, right? Our ancient ancestors that didn't have gag reflexes, maybe they survived, because there's some of us that don't have gag reflexes, but for the most part they choked on stuff and died, and the strong survived, and here we are with gag reflexes. And so what do you suppose is going to happen if you have an unconscious patient who has an intact gag reflex, because maybe they're only a little bit unconscious, and you insert a plastic question mark shaped piece of plastic into the back of their throat? You're going to initiate that gag reflex. And as someone very, very eloquently said, it makes you vomit. It makes you puke, right? So the only thing worse than the tongue blocking the airway is a vomit blocking the airway, because vomit will get down into your lungs. It has a very, very low pH. It's very acidic. It disrupts the lung tissue. You get massive pneumonia, and it just makes everything worse. Terrible, terrible stuff. And so we do not use these oral airways in patients who are not deeply unconscious, right? And so don't insert an oropharyngeal airway in a patient with a gag reflex. And likewise, if you insert an OPA in someone who doesn't have a gag reflex right now, and then you are very successful in all of the other medicine that you do, and they wake up a little bit, and all of a sudden they now have a gag reflex, be very aware that if they start gagging, you need to take this out of their mouth so that they don't vomit, right? Because again, the only thing worse than whatever you have going on is whatever you have going on plus the need to suction their airway because they just filled it with stewed tomato and rice. So you can put these in cardiac arrest, very, very easy, very quick to insert, very effective. So if you're doing CPR, expect to at some point insert an oral airway, because this will help you maintain an airway while you provide ventilations using a bag valve mask. We're going to select an appropriate OPA. We're going to measure the OPA by following what we call anatomic landmarks. right? So we want it to start at the mouth and hook behind the tongue. And so how are we going to figure out where the tongue is on the inside of their mouth? Well, we know that anatomically speaking, the tongue follows from about the corner of the mouth down to the angle of the jaw. That is where your tongue exists. And so how are we going to measure an oral airway? From the corner of the mouth to the angle of the jaw, because that's where the tongue is, right? So we're using anatomic landmarks in order to select the appropriate size. Now, if your OPA is too small, it's going to squish into the tongue and push it to the back of the throat, right? The opposite of what you want to happen. And if it's too big, it's not going to pull the tongue up off the roof of the mouth. It's just going to sit on the back of the throat with the tongue and obstruct the airway. So we want the correct size before we insert it. And then we'll talk about how to insert it when we get into the lab. There's a few different ways. I believe the book has you inserting it upside down and then turning it 360 degrees. My preferred method is to go in at a sort of 90-degree angle and sweep it under. But fundamentally, what you're trying to do, actually, I'll ask that as a question. What is this device designed to do? Fundamentally, what are you doing inside of the throat?
Holding the tongue.
You're lifting that tongue out of the way, right? So I am very focused on performance, right? What is the objective? You're moving the tongue out of the way. Does it matter if you start upside down and rotate 360 degrees, or you start at the corner of the mouth and rotate 90 degrees? It does not matter. What matters is you get that thing underneath the tongue and lift the tongue off the back of the throat. All right. So your book happens to do the 180 turn. It doesn't matter what technique you use, as long as it is effective. And you'll see a couple different techniques as you travel through your EMS career. All right, so we're going to move on to the nasopharyngeal airway. This is something that can be used in both conscious and unconscious patients, because this doesn't reach down far enough to stimulate that gag reflex, right? So this is something that I used a lot in the city of Manchester when we were treating overdose patients, because it was relatively quick to insert, and we knew that once we opened their airway and started delivering oxygen and got their oxygen saturation up, then we would give some Narcan to reverse the opioid, and they would start breathing again. They were going to wake up. And so we knew the clinical course of the treatment ended up with this patient being conscious. So this was the best airway, because we knew that this person was going to wake up and develop a gag reflex, right? And so these are the sorts of things that I want you thinking about. Now, someone in the chat asked, don't those hurt? Well, anything hurts if you do it wrong enough. So I have inserted these things on myself in the military. A lot of our airway classes, you don't leave the room until you've both inserted one of these on your classmates and had one inserted on you. This is something that if you have correct technique, it does not hurt that much. It's a bit uncomfortable, right? But it shouldn't hurt. And some of the things that you can do to make this hurt a lot is try to insert it without proper lubricant. So each of these should come with a water-based surgical lubricant. If you try to use the patient's spit, if you try to use blood or mucus, if you try to put it in dry, then it is not appropriately lubricated. It's going to catch on the delicate mucosal membranes of the nose, and you're going to tear the flesh on the inside of their nose. You're going to give them a bloody nose. And now not only do you have a collapsed airway, but now you have a collapsed airway full of blood that you caused, right? So that's one of the things that you can do, appropriate lubricant. The other thing you can do is remember the anatomy of the inside of the nose. So a lot of people think of going up the nose, but if you go up your nose, what are you poking? What's up here? Your brain. I saw someone say it. Your brain, right? your brain is very indirectly involved in respiration. Really, it doesn't really have a big role that we're concerned with at the present time. And so what we want to do is we actually want to go straight back, because what's on the other side of the roof of your mouth? What's right above the roof of your mouth? The bottommost portion of your nose, right? So right over the top of your hard palate is the bottom of your nasal cavity. And so when we insert this, we want to go straight back over that nasal cavity to the pharynx. And remember, going back to that illustration that I showed you earlier in the slide deck, the area in the back of the throat where the nose and the mouth connect, that's where the tip of this wants to be. And so if you shove it up someone's nose, it's just going to hit the bottom of their cranium, and it's going to get stuck, and it's going to tear tissue, and it's going to hurt, and it's going to cause bleeding, right? And that's only because you did it wrong. So to answer your question, to over answer your question, anything can hurt if you do it wrong enough. And so what I would like you to do is I would like you to execute this skill correctly, and you'll get plenty of practice doing that. All right. So again, how do we measure this? So once again, we are using anatomic landmarks. So where is this thing going? Well, it's going from one of your nostrils to that area in the back of the throat where the nose and the mouth meet. So how are we going to size this? We're going to follow that basic pathway from the corner of the nose back to where the nose and the mouth meet, which is the angle of your jaw, right? And so you'll see this described in various different textbooks in different ways. The corner of the nose to the earlobe, the corner of the nose to the corner of the jaw, the center of the nose to the earlobe. Listen, it's all very, very, very similar, all right? We're following those anatomic landmarks in order to choose the most appropriate length for the patient, all right? So again, we're going to select the appropriate size. In this case, measuring from the corner of the nose to the earlobe, we're going to coat this in a small amount of water-based lubricant. What happens if you take the entire pack of lube and just dump the whole thing, just like ice it like a cake or like mustard on a hot dog, and then shove it in someone's nose? What have you just done to that patient's airway?
You're blocking their airway just like a cake batter.
Exactly. You're filling their airway with lubricant, right? So a little bit goes a long way. We want to coat this with lubricant so that it is slick enough to slide into the patient's nasopharynx. Yes, Morgan, actually you can plug these with lubricant if you do it wrong enough. So remember, anything hurts if you do it wrong enough. Reagan asks, are these hard or are they flexible? These are silicone tubes. They are just like, they're very, very flexible. They're like a wet noodle. Once it's fully inserted, then it will sit sort of just in the back of the throat. So if this is the appropriate size, if you were curious and inquisitive, you could actually open the patient's mouth, have them stick their tongue out and say ah, and you'll be able to see the tip of it hanging out just behind the hard palate. If you're inserting an airway, most of these patients aren't going to say ah for you, so it's sort of a moot point in clinical practice. But if you ever get to do this on one of your coworkers, you'll notice that. All right, so we've managed airway, and you'll remember on your assessment, your skill sheets, that for A, B, and C, it's an assess and manage sequence. So we need to assess the airway by opening it, and then we need to manage the airway by selecting the appropriate airway technique, right? So if your patient is unconscious, you'll open the airway using a head tilt, chin lift, or jaw thrust. And then you'll say, I would maintain this person's airway by inserting a nasopharyngeal airway, or, I would maintain this person's airway by inserting an oropharyngeal airway, right? I believe on the state exam, you'll only have an oropharyngeal airway, so you won't have to make that choice. But remember, it's a sequence of assess and manage. Likewise, for breathing, we need to assess and manage breathing. And what we're assessing for is whether or not their breathing is adequate. How do we determine if their breathing is adequate? Two things. Is their breathing rate normal, and is their breathing depth adequate, right? So too slow or too fast on the rate is inadequate. Too shallow or too deep is concerning as well. And so we need to look, listen, and feel for both of these things to get a sense for whether their breathing is adequate. So some other signs of inadequate breathing. Again, as we're sitting here, listening to our own breathing, what do we hear?
Nothing.
Yes, exactly. Nothing. Normal people don't make noise when they breathe, right? Normal people. There's some mouth breathers out there that make a lot of noise when they breathe, but normal people, they don't make noise when they breathe and they're not sick. So if someone is making noise, if they're gurgling, they're wheezing, they're snoring, right? This indicates a partial blockage or constriction somewhere along the respiratory tract. So if they're snoring, we know that's an upper airway obstruction, usually their tongue. And we know if they're wheezing, that's a sign of lower airway obstruction like asthma or something like that. Other things that we can see that will demonstrate to us that breathing is inadequate. Again, the rapid or gasping respirations, what we like to call guppy breathing, where they're gulping for air. Or if the patient's skin is blue, specifically blue, what we call cyanosis. Remember, cyan is kind of a bluish color. Cyanosis is a condition of being blue. And so that only comes from hypoxia. And that's another sign that their breathing is not adequate. And again, we're looking, we're listening, and we're feeling. So what are we looking for? Chest rise and fall. What are we feeling for? Again, like air against the side of your face, unless they're like pursing their lips and blowing into your ear, which at that point I would be very concerned about the status of this patient. You're not going to feel their breath against your face if they're breathing normally. So if you do feel breath against their face, maybe they're messing with you. But one of the other things I like to feel for, especially if the patients are unconscious, or if I'm in, say, a helicopter, or I'm on a noisy scene, or it's really dark out, you can put your hand on their chest and feel the chest rise and fall as well, right? So you're using as many of your senses as you can to get an idea of this patient's breathing status. So what are some ways that, or what are some reasons why people have inadequate breathing? Well, if your heart stops, your breathing stops. We discussed that already. Mechanical blockage, we're pretty familiar with that. So again, blockage caused by the tongue, blockage caused by other things like vomit, partially chewed food, things like that. And then there's some illnesses and diseases that we'll talk about that cause airway obstruction. Other things that we maybe don't think about at first blush, there are certain drugs that shut down our respiratory drive. And the biggest thing that we were dealing with a couple years ago, and is still sort of ongoing, is opioids in high doses. So if you take a lot of an opioid medication, or if you take illicit opioid-based drugs, then that suppresses your drive to breathe. And as a result, you'll become hypoxic and eventually go into cardiac arrest. Other types of poisoning, so for example, it's winter. If you try to work on your car in the garage with the door closed to keep the heat in and it's running, then you get carbon monoxide poisoning, and that is displacing oxygen in your body, and that's also going to cause a respiratory arrest, but for a different reason than not being able to breathe. Nick, what you got?
A couple years back, we went to a scene where someone was actually cleaning their cat box inside of their bathroom using bleach, and actually was able to suffocate themselves out.
Yeah, bleach and ammonia. A little bit of chemical warfare to take care of the cat. I'm with it. I'm down. I'm not a cat owner. So severe loss of blood, we talked about that a little bit. If you don't have blood in your body to transport that oxygen, you're gonna suffocate, and you're sort of gonna suffocate. You're gonna die for other reasons, but we really want to keep that blood in our body as much as we can. And then last thing on the list, so if you are electrocuted, then a lot of times that will sort of hijack your cardiac and nervous system function. You may stop breathing then. So what are we going to do? We're going to assess. First, we're going to determine level of responsiveness. You know, hey, my name's Max. I'm an EMR. I'm here to help you. What seems to be the problem? Sir, can you wake up for me? Little sternal rub. All right, this person is unconscious. I'm going to open the airway. I'm going to look, listen, and feel. So now I'm assessing their breathing, and I'm going to determine whether it's adequate or not. Correct the breathing. So we don't do mouth-to-mouth. We stopped doing mouth-to-mouth before there was a respiratory pandemic, but especially now that there's a respiratory pandemic, we really like to keep our germs to ourselves and their germs to themselves. So don't pinch the nose, take a deep breath, and blow slowly into their mouth for 1 second, no matter how romantic that sounds to you. Instead, we're going to use some sort of barrier device. And so pictured here is a mouth-to-mask rescue breathing device. And these are also sold under the name pocket mask. And so these compress down into a very flat sort of cone-shaped package. They're very easy to transport. They'll fit inside your first aid bags, your first in bags. And what these allow you to do is create a seal around the patient's nose and mouth, and then breathe slowly into that one-way valve that will prevent their substances from coming up into your mouth, and that will allow you to provide ventilation before you get access to a ventilator, like a bag valve mask device. There are other mouth-to-barrier rescue breathing devices. I used to carry one of the sheets that you can unfold, and it has a barrier on it. We're not going to be playing with those in class. We're going to stick with sort of the rescuer masks and things like that. But those are an option if you want to carry them around on your keychain. Fun fact, the only time I've ever needed to use that, I had actually given my keys to someone else, and so that I actually had to do mouth-to-mouth, and that was not great, but it looked awesome. Again, mouth-to-mouth rescue breathing. We're not going to get into this a whole lot. It's been taken out of a lot of CPR certifications. It's not something we practice. It's not something we're going to do in lab. Again, we're going to keep our germs to ourselves. And we're going to opt for using what's called a bag valve mask device. And as the name implies, this is a bag that you can squeeze that is attached to a valve that hooks onto a mask. The valve makes it so that when you squeeze the bag, the air goes into their face, and when you release the bag, the air then flows out into the atmosphere while the bag fills back up with pure oxygen if you have it hooked up. So it is a bag, a valve, and a mask. And so we just call it the BVM, or when you hear someone say, I need you to bag this person, that is the bag that they're talking about. They're talking about a BVM. And so what you're going to do is place the mask over the nose and mouth of the patient. You're going to squeeze the bag to deliver an appropriate amount of air, and we'll talk about what that looks like when we get into lab. And then when you release, the patient exhales with the natural elasticity of their chest, and the waste air is delivered into the environment. And so that's what this looks like. Here we have a two-rescuer BVM technique. You have one person. You see that the fingers are underneath the chin here, maintaining that airway in an open position. Because again, if a BVM is like walking through a door and you try to walk through the door while it's closed, the only thing you get is a smushed face. And so same here. I've arrived on scene many a times to find first responding agencies using the old head tilt chin smash maneuver. And when you squeeze the bag, all you hear is the air kind of escaping out around the mask because it can't actually get into the patient. And so a really, really important part of ventilation is keeping that airway open. That's why A comes before B. So you see this person is creating a great seal around the face, he's got fingers underneath the chin. He's pulling the head up into that sniffing position, that head tilt chin lift position. And then this person is delivering with one hand. He's not squeezing with both hands. With one hand, he's delivering an appropriate volume of air into this patient. All right, so a quick review here. We're about halfway through this slide deck, if you can believe it or not. So a quick review. You need to assume that all patients may be in respiratory arrest until you can assess them and determine whether they're breathing adequately. So again, our first check for the airway comes with our initial check for responsiveness. If they can talk with you, then their airway is, for the most part, open. Their breathing may not be great, but at least their airway is open. If the patient's unresponsive and the EMS system hasn't been notified, make sure that you call dispatch, activate EMS, get help on the way, and then position this patient in whatever position is going to best allow you to open and maintain their airway. Make sure you check their mouth for any secretions, vomit, solid objects. If you can see something, go ahead and grab it. Correct a blocked airway if you can by using that finger sweep, but remember, we don't use blind finger sweeps. And then maintain the airway by either manually holding it open or by using one of those oral or nasal adjuncts. So once we've assessed and managed airway, we'll go on to assess and manage breathing. So again, we check for the presence of breathing using a look, listen, and feel approach. If we determine that their breathing is inadequate, we can correct the lack of breathing by performing rescue breathing using a BVM or other techniques if needed. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is let's break for another 10 minutes. And then we'll do our final push to the end of this slide deck, and then we're going to get a lot more hands-on, not this Saturday, but next Saturday. So go ahead, take 10, and be back here at 10 past 9. All right, so just a quick word about rescue breathing on children and infants. They have naturally higher respiratory rates, something that we'll talk about when we get into special populations, pediatrics. But we are going to give them rescue breaths 1 every 3 to 5 seconds, which is somewhere around 12 to 20 breaths per minute, which is the normal rate for a young child. So again, if you're going to remember any number for children, breath every 3 seconds as opposed to the normal breath every 5 to 6 seconds for an adult. So infants, a breath every 3 seconds. And then the other thing to remember about very, very small children is that the amount of air that you're going to put into their body should be just the amount sufficient to cause chest rise and fall. And so what is this sort of practically like if you're doing mouth-to-mask ventilation? This is about the same amount of air that you can hold in your cheeks, right? So if you are someone who wears glasses and you breathe on your glasses in order to clean them, it's about the same amount of air that you breathe out when you're just fogging your glasses. So it's a very, very small amount of air. Getting into foreign airway body obstruction, again, tongue is the most common. We can remove the tongue, or not remove the tongue. Please don't remove the tongue. We can get the tongue out of the way by using a head tilt chin lift or jaw thrust. Again, if we can see something, we can go in and grab it. If we can't see it, then don't try to do blind finger sweeps. And if the mouth is filling up with something, we can always use suction to get it out. So again, here is a bunch of illustrations that let us know that the tongue blocks the airway. We have boluses. We have boluses of whatever, so food or toys or whatnot stuck in the throat. And then obviously trauma, swelling can cause obstruction. So we learned all of this stuff in CPR course. So first step is to ask if they're choking, or watch them for the universal sign of choking, which is the hands across the neck. Seems to be a reflex. And then of course encourage them to cough. If they can't cough, then perform abdominal thrusts, the maneuver formerly known as the Heimlich maneuver. Some of the other indicators that we have is, again, a high-pitched squeaking noise. That is not the same as coughing. The high-pitched, what we call stridorous or stridor. This is the name of the sound of squeaking, and that is indicative of an upper airway obstruction. And then a silent cough. So it looks like they're coughing, but there's no sound or no air coming out. So again, we're going to perform that abdominal thrust maneuver. Stand behind them, forcefully thrust underneath their rib cage up into where their lungs exist in their body. So we're sort of going halfway between the bottom of their rib cage and their belly button, making a fist, and then pulling in and up. And the idea is that we are compressing any residual air in their lungs in order to pop that airway obstruction out like a cork. If that fails, then eventually they will go unconscious. They will pass out, at which point we just do CPR, because chest compressions perform the same mechanical motion as, or the same mechanical function as those abdominal thrusts. And if the object becomes dislodged once they're laying down, we can, again, if we can see it, we can go in and grab it. If the child is very, very small, we know that we can alternate between back pats and abdominal thrusts. Just remember, if you're doing a back pat, that the head has to be slightly lower than the rest of their body. If someone is standing up and choking on something, and you come up behind them and you slap them on the back, if you dislodge that object, which is the whole point of slapping someone on the back, right? What direction is that object going to go?
Further down.
Right, which is the opposite of what we want, right? So if you do back pats on someone who's standing up, or if you do back pats on an infant with their head higher than the rest of their body, what you're doing is you're moving that object further down towards the lungs and making everything worse. So make sure that you do your back pats with the head slightly lower than the rest of the body. Okay, so let's talk about oxygen. This is going to be a big part of what we're expected to perform for our exams and during the lab. So for oxygen equipment, we carry in the ambulance tanks of compressed medical grade oxygen. Most of these tanks are going to be the D-sized cylinder, but we also usually ambulances have a much larger E-sized cylinder that carries enough gas to feed all of the spouts throughout the truck. The ones that we're going to be using in class are the D cylinders. And so D cylinders have about 360 liters worth of oxygen that is compressed inside the tank to create 2,000 psi, or pounds per square inch, 2,000 psi of pressure inside that tank. So it's under a great deal of pressure. And it's under a lot of pressure because we want to pack in as much oxygen as we can. Now, this should last us, in most cases, around 20 minutes. Certainly longer than that if we don't give a high rate of oxygen, and sometimes even less than that if we have this thing cranked all the way up. And we'll talk about how much oxygen to deliver and at what time. But remember that the pressure of a full tank is 2,000 psi. So if we just open this tank up and sort of, hooked a patient up to it, you can imagine there'd be a lot of oxygen coming out all at once, right? Which could be damaging for a lot of reasons, right? There's not too many places where the human body can withstand 2,000 pounds per square inch of pressure. And so how do we get the oxygen out in a controlled manner that doesn't hurt people and make a lot of noise? And the answer is a regulator. A regulator is something that takes high pressure and converts it to low pressure. And so in this case, we have an oxygen regulator. Now, all gases that you can buy in tanks have a regulator that is specific for that gas, right? And you can't switch around regulators. You can't put like an acetylene regulator on an oxygen tank. It just doesn't work like that. And so what you'll see when we get into lab is that these regulators have index marks on them. You cannot physically put an oxygen regulator on any other tank because it has metal pins that line up with holes on the stem of the oxygen tank. You can't put it on backwards, you can't put it on upside down. It only goes on one way. Also, this regulator will have a flow meter on it. So it will have a dial that shows you the internal pressure of the tank. And again, a full tank is how many PSI?
2000.
Great. Nick, I love the hand and arm signals there. It was great. Yes, 2000 PSI for a full tank. And now on the other side, you see that there's a dial here. There's a little spout that you can attach things to. And then there's a dial here that lets you choose how many liters per minute of oxygen that's coming out of that. There's also a gasket that makes sure that when you attach this regulator, the oxygen will flow through the flow meter and not just leak out and make lots of noise. So what can we attach to this regulator? Oh, Nick, you got a question.
As I work for Airgas and actually work in small meds and handle these tanks all throughout New England, I recommend that you do not crack that seal until you have a regulator on that bottle. It will literally blow your skin off your body.
So I appreciate that you said that. However, when we use these, we are going to crack it without a regulator on. It is an important step of the process, especially if you don't have a pre-sealed tank. What we do is we just crack it a little bit, let a bit of air out, and it's supposed to blow the dust out of the hole. That said, usually I get these tanks from a place like Airgas. They have a plastic seal or some kind of wrapper over them. You take that seal off and you put the regulator on immediately. So in practice, does cracking the tank do much? No, unless you have an unsealed, partially filled tank that you need to use for some reason. But we will practice cracking the tank because that is a step you'll be expected to perform. But to Nick's point, it comes out with not only a lot of force but a lot of noise. And so we will become very familiar, because I'm sure folks in this class will do this in the wrong sequence, and happens every class. Someone's going to open that tank up without a regulator on, and everyone in the building is going to hear it. It sounds like a hurricane. Okay, so what do we attach to these regulators? What are we putting on in order to deliver oxygen? Well, there's a few oxygen delivery devices, including nasal cannula and masks of various sorts. And so we'll talk about each one of these and what they're used for. So some safety considerations. Oxygen is one of the key components of combustion. You can't have a fire if you don't have oxygen, for the most part. And so if there's oxygen in the environment that is of higher concentration, you'll expect everything there to be a little bit more combustible. So no open sparks, no open flames. Please don't smoke inside the ambulance as a general rule. But just be aware that this is a fire hazard. So how do we assemble this? We'll go over this more in lab. This is definitely a hands-on skill. But again, you slide the, you're going to crack the tank, make sure that there's no dust in this port. You're going to slide the regulator down. You see that these two holes right here are indexing holes for the indexing pin on the regulator. And so you'll fit those together. Again, you can't put it on upside down, doesn't go on backwards. It only goes one way. When you put on the regulator, it should be hand tight. You don't need to crank it down in order to get a good seal. That's what the gasket is for. And then you're going to do three things once you get the regulator on. You're going to open the tank, you're going to check the pressure, and you're going to check for leaks. And I expect you to verbalize all three of those things in order to get all 3 points on your test. So you're going to open it up. You're going to check the gauge on the pressure regulator / flow meter to make sure that you have adequate air for whatever you're trying to do. and then you're going to check for leaks. And checking for leaks is as simple as just listening, because it will be very obvious if this thing is leaking. It will make a very loud hissing noise. All right, so nasal cannula. You're going to have to remember some numbers with these. So a nasal cannula is a tube that goes from the regulator and then ends up going up your nose. So you have two prongs that go up your nose, one in each nostril. Now the tube goes over your ears and tightens up under your chin. All right, doesn't go any other way. You're not going to put it over the nose, under the ear, and coming off the top of the head. It only goes up the nose, over the ears, under the chin. And this is good for between 1 and 6 liters per minute. All right, so the flow rate of nasal cannula is between 1 and 6 per minute. The flow rate of a nasal cannula is between 1 and 6 liters per minute. You can adjust the regulator to anywhere in between 1 and 6 liters per minute. The next oxygen delivery device that we're going to use is what's called a non-rebreathing mask. And so this is a plastic mask. It has a reservoir built onto it that fills up with oxygen, right? And so as you use this, the bag will fill up with oxygen, and as the patient breathes in, they will breathe in all the oxygen from that bag, and when they breathe out, their exhaled gas will come out through these valves on either side of the mask, right? So the oxygen only goes in one direction. Oxygen comes into the mask, they breathe it in. When they breathe out, there's a valve here that prevents it from going into the bag, and instead it goes out the side of the mask. So the flow rate that you need for this mask is greater than 8. So the book and the rest of medicine tend to disagree here, and I'm going to change this number. All right. The flow rate for a non-rebreather mask needs to be greater than 10 liters per minute. 10 is the number you need to remember. This slide and the state of New Hampshire disagree. And so, considering that we're all going to be licensed in the state of New Hampshire, I choose to go with the state of New Hampshire. So the minimum flow rate for a non-rebreather mask is 10 liters per minute. And then it can go very high as the regulator has numbers for. So up to 20, 25, right? But what I recommend is that you pick a number and you stick with it. So generally speaking, you'll hear a lot of people say they're going to put them on a non-rebreather at 12 liters per minute, something like that. I don't care what number you use, 10, 12, 15, as long as it is 10 or greater, you'll get the answer right. Now, why is this? Why can't we give someone less than 10 liters per minute through a non-rebreather mask? So if I tell you that you breathe, each breath you take is about half a liter, and you're taking 10 to 12 breaths per minute, that's several liters worth of oxygen that you are consuming normally. Now, if you're in any sort of respiratory distress, you're going to be breathing faster than that. You're going to have a higher oxygen demand. So if I tell you that someone who is sick and breathing heavily is taking in 12, 15, 20 liters per minute, and you put this mask on them that has valves that prevent them from breathing in the air in the room and prevent them from collecting the air back into the bag that fills up with the oxygen, what's going to happen to that patient?
They're going to feel like they're suffocating?
Absolutely. There's not going to be enough air. Forget the oxygen. There's not going to be enough oxygen, that's for certain. There's not going to be enough air for them to breathe in fully. They are going to feel like they're suffocating. And because it's only held on by a rubber band, these are the patients that are going to be clawing this mask off their face so that they can gasp for room air, right? So, and I've responded to situations where someone has applied one of these masks at like 4 liters per minute, and the patient was suffocating. Their oxygen levels were very low. And the only intervention I had to apply in order to rescue this person was simply take the mask off their face, and immediately their oxygen levels started to go back up, right? Because this mask, if you do not feed it with enough oxygen, it will suffocate your patient. All right? So that's important to remember. The minimum number here is 10 liters per minute. Write that down. Repeat it to yourself. 10 liters per minute. All right, so when do we use each of these? Well, it depends on what's going on with the patient and their need for oxygen. If you see someone, usually nasal cannula are used for at-home oxygen. So a lot of times you'll go into someone's home. If they have at-home oxygen, they'll have the nasal cannula on. And if you're being called to their house, chances are it's perhaps because the nasal cannula that they're wearing is insufficient for their oxygen demands, at which point you'll upgrade them to something that will deliver more oxygen, in this case a non-rebreathing mask. Much of the time when you make the decision to put oxygen on a patient, you're going to start off with one of these non-rebreathing masks. Now, EMTs, advanced EMTs, paramedics, they have specialty equipment that will give them an indication of how much oxygen is attached to their blood cells. And they can make determinations about how much oxygen and what type of device based on those numbers. But we don't, as a matter of course, have access to pulse oximetry and things like that. And so what we're going to make the determination by is their breathing adequate? Is their rate and depth of breathing sufficient to support them? And if not, do I need to either give them oxygen via a non-rebreather mask at 10 to 15 liters per minute, or do I need to ventilate them using a bag valve mask, again with high flow oxygen attached, something greater than 12 to 15 liters per minute? So what kind of patients are these? So you're going to be called for complaints like shortness of breath, any complaint of chest pain that you think is cardiac related. Also, we want to feed that with oxygen. Any poisoning, including carbon monoxide or opioid overdose, things like that, we're going to give them oxygen. And then there are other conditions that they may say they have, like, for example, congestive heart failure, which a lot of times will manifest with shortness of breath, or signs and symptoms of shock, especially if they're bleeding out. Every red blood cell counts at that point, and we want to load them up with as much oxygen as we can. We have to be careful with our use of supplemental oxygen, not necessarily because everything around you is going to explode, but we want to give it to the right patients at the right time and the right amount, right? Especially if we only have one tank and we think there's going to be longer than 20 minutes to get to definitive care or to get an ambulance to you. Make sure you're not just, needlessly putting oxygen on every patient. Make sure that these patients have some sort of respiratory complaint, are complaining of some sort of respiratory issue or shortness of breath. And we'll get into more of this when we get into class. So speaking of pulse oximetry, so many ambulances will have cardiac monitors with pulse oximeters on them. They'll have these large pulse oximeter units that are independent of their monitors. Very rarely do I see the small finger pulse oximeters that, for example, we'd carry in the military, or you can buy for $20 off Amazon. But in any case, this is a specialized monitor that looks at effectively the color of your blood and gives its best mathematical algorithmic guess as to how much oxygen there is on the blood. Now, there are a lot of, this is an excellent device. There are a lot of ways the device can be confused because it is measuring different wavelengths of light. So there's a lot of things that can interfere with that. But in general, it is an excellent tool if you can get your hands on one. And so one of the things that that you'll see throughout the New Hampshire protocols is that if the patient's blood oxygen saturation is below 94%, then we'll want to put oxygen on them. And then on the other end of that spectrum, if their oxygen saturation is above 99, so if you put them on oxygen and the meter's just pegged out at 100%, maybe they don't need as much oxygen as you're giving them. There is such a thing as too much oxygen. And so this is a tool that we can use to determine how much oxygen that we will be giving. Now again, your book and the state of New Hampshire use slightly different values. In the book, you'll see 95% as the lower threshold. In our protocols, you'll see 94%. So again, medicine in general is probabilistic. There are a lot of different guidelines that are all correct, and it really depends on what your patient looks like. So no one number, no one vital sign is going to give you a full picture of what's going on with your patient. And so again, state of New Hampshire uses 94%, your book uses 95%. So again, we talk about limitations. If it's measuring blood, if it's measuring effectively the color of your blood, then if you're cold, there's not going to be blood flowing through your fingertips. That's why your fingertips get cold. If you've lost a lot of blood or you're going into shock, again, it can't measure the blood that isn't there. If the patient is wearing gloves, if they have false nails, if they have a really, really dark pigmented nail polish, these are all things that are going to interfere with the passage of light through the capillary bed. And then there are other types of poisoning, carbon monoxide being one example, where the poison attaches to the blood and makes it look like it has oxygen, but it's really not oxygen. Catherine, what question you got? Catherine, you raised your hand? Okay. Well, you can type it in the chat if you are having trouble with your microphone. All right, so moving on here. Stoma. So a stoma is an opening in some part of the body. You can have a stoma in your neck, especially if you've had certain surgeries or certain cancers. If a patient has a stoma, instead of breathing through their nose and their mouth, you're going to breathe through the opening in their neck. And so usually you'll use a smaller pediatric mask in order to ventilate through this hole. All right. Catherine is typing her question. I am waiting with bated breath. All right, so Catherine asks a great question. So the state of New Hampshire says 94. The book says 95. How are you going to answer that on the test? I will tell you that the test is not going to give you a set of numbers that are that close together. They're going to give you something like an oxygen saturation of 89, right? Something that's obviously low, right? So we're not gonna try to trick you up with questions like their oxygen saturation is 94% or 95%. Which one are you going to give oxygen to? Does that answer the question?
Then Max, to go along with that also, what about the 1 to 6 and the 10 to 15?
So I don't think there are any questions in the test bank that give you give you numbers that are that close together.
So it's the same concept of for the breathing then too, for the oxygen?
I hope so. But here's the thing. I put the grades in the grade book. So if you come across that question and you answer it correctly, but it marks it as incorrect, just, raise hell and I'll change it. just complain, and if you complain enough, things happen, right? The squeaky wheel gets replaced. No, gets the oil. Yep, that's it. All right, so gastric distension. Gastric distension is gastric refers to your stomach, right? So you'll hear lots of things like gastrointestinal tract, or there's a bariatric surgery called I think it's gastric bands, or gastric refers to the stomach. And so what is distension? Distension is some sort of swelling or inflation. So when we put that together, gastric distension is when we force air into the stomach because we are bagging inappropriately. And remember, anything can hurt if you do it wrong enough. And so if you ventilate your patient wrong enough, you can fill their stomach full of air. And so what happens when your stomach gets full of air? What do you do? What happens to your body when your stomach is full of air? I like it. Dustin says burp. Yes. Nick says vomit. Also yes. And if you're really unlucky, you do both at the same time. Fun fact, if you like space trivia, you cannot burp in space. You will always vomit in space because there's no gravity to keep your gastric contents down. And so if you're that's why they don't have carbonated beverages on the space station. But also, if you need to burp, you have to push off one wall and burp at the same time so that all the stomach contents goes down and the air can come out. So definitely I think some skill involved there. I wonder how many times astronauts vomit while they're trying to burp just before they get the technique down. These are the things I think about. All right, we're moving on. So when we force air into a patient's stomach because we're bagging them too forcefully, if we squeeze that bag really fast or if we deliver too much air, their lungs will fill up first and then the back pressure will force all of that air down into their stomach. Or, again, if we do this wrong enough, we can just force all that air straight down into their stomach because that esophagus is just basically a muscular sleeve and it can be opened up with very little force. So again, we can use this bag valve mask as a tool to hurt patients if we're not doing it correctly. And so how do we fix this? Well, the answer is that we deliver only enough air to cause chest rise and that we deliver the air in a slow and controlled manner. So you should deliver your breath over the course of about 1 to 2 seconds. Dental appliances. So we talked about this before. I think it was William that brought it up. We don't remove dental appliances that are firmly attached. So if their adhesive is working, the teeth are firm, it actually provides additional structure in the face that allow us to get a better seal with our masks. So if you remove the dentures, if you somehow pry them out, then you're actually destabilizing the whole structure of the face. That said, if they are loose, then they can become an airway obstruction, especially once you start fiddling around inside their airway. Some special situations, if your patient is seated in a vehicle, then reaching in and sort of doing these techniques from the side can be cumbersome. There's a few options: getting in the seat behind them and trying to perform a jaw thrust from behind. Not always the greatest option, especially if you're holding C-spine at the same time. But, again, reaching in through the window and trying to do these techniques, also not ideal. And so manage the airway as best you can until you can get this patient into a position where you can effectively perform medical skills. And so that may involve rapid extrication like we practiced during the lifting and moving station. And so this is just going over that technique. So again, we see someone coming in, holding C-spine as best they can, and then with their other hand here, they're sort of performing a combination head tilt, chin lift, jaw thrust type maneuver. And again, are they doing the head tilt, chin lift or the jaw thrust? Are they doing either of those maneuvers very effectively? And the answer is no. Also, they're in the way for anyone to come in and try to extricate this patient, right? So do the best you can with the resources that you have available at the time until you can do something better, potentially with more help. All right, so let's summarize here, and then we'll get into some questions. So the main purpose of the respiratory system is to provide oxygen and to remove carbon dioxide from the red blood cells as they pass through the lungs. The structure of the respiratory system in children and infants is smaller and more flexible than the corresponding structures in adults. And as a consequence, the air passages of children may be more easily blocked by secretion of foreign objects. Also, kids tend to put more foreign objects in their mouth, so there's that. When a patient experiences possible respiratory arrest, first we check for responsiveness. Then we do our standard open the airway using the head tilt, chin lift, or jaw thrust maneuver. We're checking for anything obstructing the airway, fluids, solids, dentures, broken teeth, partially chewed steak. And then we're going to do what we need to do to correct that airway if needed. We can use finger sweeps if we can visualize the object, or we can use suction if needed. Once the door is open, we have to hold it open. So we can maintain the airway by continuing to manually hold it open. But if you're the only person on scene, or you're the highest trained medical person on scene, your hands are a valuable resource. And so if we open the door, we can use something to hold it open, like an oral or nasal airway. And then check for breathing, look, listen, and feel for air movement, correct any problems. You can use a mouth to mask, you can use a bag valve mask, or any of these other breathing devices if respiration is insufficient. We can also apply oxygen. If the airway is obstructed in a conscious adult or child, we're going to do all of the abdominal compression, Heimlich maneuver type sequence that we learned in CPR. When we administer supplemental oxygen to patients who show signs and symptoms of shock, it increases the amount of oxygen delivered to the cells and often makes a positive difference in these critically ill patients. Patients who have experienced a heart attack or stroke, patients who have chronic heart or lung disease can also benefit from receiving supplemental oxygen. Again, we're trying to deliver as much of that oxygen as possible to these damaged tissues. If we have it, pulse oximetry can be used to assess the amount of oxygen that we have saturating the red blood cells, and can be used to sort of make the determination of what we can use to deliver oxygen and how much oxygen should be delivered to this patient. All right, so let's get into these review questions, and then I will answer any questions that you have and cut you loose for the evening. So, after opening the airway of a patient who has a pulse but is unconscious, you should next perform a blind finger sweep, immediately attempt to insert an oral airway, check for secretions, foreign bodies, or dentures, or perform CPR. C, senor. That's right. It is number C. Check for secretions, foreign bodies, or dentures. Absolutely. All right, 2. You should place a patient in the recovery position to prevent the patient from going into respiratory arrest, allow secretions to drain out of the mouth, to protect the patient's spine from injury, or to facilitate the administration of supplemental oxygen. All right, does anyone think it's not B? That's a trick question because it's totally B. Everyone got it correct. Great. Pulse oximetry is used to assess the amount of oxygen saturated in the red blood cells, to provide supplemental oxygen to the patient, to assess how much oxygen the patient requires, or to eliminate carbon dioxide from the bloodstream. Now, in this one, both B and C could be attractive answers. So does anyone want to tell me why A is the correct answer? Some critical thinking here.
You'll have to actually get the oxygen saturation level to determine if you actually need to. You need that information before you can determine how much oxygen they need, right?
I like it. I like it. I like what Nick said. Nick, do you want to come on and explain what you mean by measuring tool? Or do you not have a microphone? No mic. So, okay. No mic and food. So the thing that provides supplemental oxygen, the thing that assesses how much oxygen the patient requires, is actually the device that is situated between your ears. You are the person determining those things. The pulse oximeter is merely a tool. It is a tool that has lots of ways that it can fail and be complicated by the environment and by the patient's condition. So it is just like our stethoscope and our blood pressure cuff and the little battery-operated pen light that always seems to be out of battery. These are just the tools that we use to make an assessment of the patient. So I really like Andrew, Nick, and Leo's answers here that we have to assess our patients before we provide treatment. That is absolutely correct and exactly what I was looking for.
I was going to say, think about it as a glucose monitor as well. It's just instead of looking for sugar, it's looking for oxygen.
Yep, exactly. And so glucose meters we're not going to cover that in an EMR class. That's in the EMT scope, but that's an excellent example. All right, so that is all the information that I have for you tonight. I am definitely going to stick around for a few more minutes. Anyone with any questions can get me talking. But if no one has any more questions, you are free to go. So Daniel had a great question. Even though we've moved away from mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, if you don't have any other equipment and you are willing to do mouth-to-mouth, absolutely. Hold the nose, cover the mouth, and breathe in. All right, folks, have a good night. Be safe tomorrow. If you do reckless things, wear personal protective equipment.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Have a good night.
I actually do have a question.
Yes, sir.
So a couple years back, we had a patient actually take a chainsaw to the face.
Nice.
And was unconscious. I was there for the initial part of the scene. I don't know what they did in the rig, but we were unable to use oral or nasal. Is that something that a tracheotomy work?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so we deal with this a lot in the military where people can have parts of their face blown off by explosive mechanisms. And so one of the first things that we teach is the sit-up, lean-forward position to allow drainage from the airway. Because in a lot of cases, when you do get your face, sort of ripped off by something, there is a lot of you don't consider the C-spine and a lot of those things because it just really isn't affected. So the chainsaw sounds very similar, where it's probably not going to be something that involves the C-spine. And so a sit-up, lean-forward position, if the patient is conscious, is really effective. Now, if the patient is unconscious, that presents a big problem because, what are you going to do? Roll them to their side? Or are you going to provide continuous suction? And so, like you said, if you can't, there's not a whole lot that we are going to do to definitively manage that airway at our level. But once you get a paramedic on scene, they can try to put a breathing tube in through the hole that used to be their face, or they can make a new hole through the front of their throat, which is not something that civilian paramedics practice much. And even in the military, we have a pretty high failure rate for that procedure. So it's a high-risk, low-frequency procedure.
Yeah, I believe he was conscious when we loaded him, and I believe he actually coded on the way to the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not necessarily sure the whole story at the end, but generally we don't get the stories at the end. So,
and that's
I just
unfortunate.
wasn't sure what your perspective would have been. So,
yeah, and that's I can't say it's difficult for me to sort of armchair quarterback a case like that because I can't see the extent of their injuries and what was bleeding. It sounded like he was bleeding a lot, but it could have been a respiratory-driven cardiac arrest. No way to know. So. Again, we do the best we can with what we have, understanding the underlying anatomy and sort of the mechanisms of injury. All right. People are sending me private messages, but I don't see them popping up.
I've got a question for you.
Yes, ma'am.
I have so I guess I'm asking because I've been in a situation where I have a friend who's like a wicked heavy smoker, like very heavy smoker. And there was a time where I was with him and he started to cough and then everything stopped and he passed out. So like as I was bringing him down to the ground, he came to, like that motion of going back and down, he came to. So what was going on in that situation? Is it
Could have been a lot of different things, and it's really hard for me to say. Smoking does a couple really interesting things, none of which I think contributed to this. One of the things that smoking does is it paralyzes the small it paralyzes the lining of your airway tract that is meant to move dust and other things that get stuck in your lungs, which is why your lungs fill up with tar, because the natural mechanism to decontaminate your lungs is paralyzed. And it's also the reason why smokers will wake up in the morning and have this rattling cough and maybe like spit up some stuff, is because for 8 hours they didn't smoke any cigarettes and their respiratory tract became unparalyzed and then worked overnight to get all this gunk that they smoked in during the course of the previous day. And then they'll cough, they'll smoke their first cigarette, they'll re-paralyze their respiratory tract, and then all of that gunk will sort of settle down into their lungs. So that's one reason why you have the smoker's cough. Now, coughing does a bunch of things inside your chest. One of the things that it does is it increases your intrathoracic pressure, or the pressure inside your chest, and that can have a number of effects. It raises your blood pressure momentarily. It presses on, the big nerve that controls your blood pressure, so it can cause what we call a vasovagal stimulus or something like that. And it's really, really difficult for me to, again, sort of come up with an explanation for this. But it was probably a bunch of factors. He could have been dehydrated on top of this. He could have, any number of things.
Yeah, it was a pretty scary, weird situation. It was wild. Never seen anything like it.
We had a patient that actually had an AVM inside their brain, obviously, was a smoker and actually coughed and actually died from it due to the AVM just detonating.
Huh. Yeah, you can't do much about that.
Hey, Max, I had a question for you.
Yes, sir.
So let me kind of tell you the scenario on it. You kind of said the resolution before, but I want to understand it from your perspective. So you have someone that's completely unresponsive, not breathing, doesn't have a pulse, but you understand from a bystander or whatever that they choked on something, and you can't get to it. You don't see it in their mouth or anything like that. So I know you understand. I understand before that you indicated that we'd have to start CPR, but I guess my question is, like, at that point, I'm not sure I understand what you should be doing besides CPR. You just, after you go to check the airway again each time, after you do your compressions, you're checking for that object possibly, or
yes. Yep. And so the idea is that once you get them flat on the ground, you're no longer fighting gravity to get that object out. And so the CPR may be more effective than your abdominal thrusts. And then eventually, if you can't get that object dislodged, then they're eventually going to go into cardiac arrest. And it's going to be respiratory driven. And so you're already doing the intervention that is needed.
Okay, understood. I probably just overthought that then.
Well, I like that you are thinking about it, because, I mean, trying to understand the underlying mechanism makes coming to the right answer when you are tired on the side of the road and everything is going wrong. You get to the right answer faster and in a more intuitive way when you've sort of worked through these problems beforehand. So I think it's a good thing.
Awesome. Thanks, Max. I appreciate it. Have a good night.
Absolutely. Right. I'm just updating people's addresses. So if anyone has any questions, I am here for it.
Max, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
So for like so we have the New Hampshire EMR like test at the end, and then there's National Registry. So for us to have our license, we need to pass the National Registry exam.
Yeah. So you have a test for this class, right? And after this class is done, you can take the National Registry exams. There's a physical exam and there's a computer test, right? A multiple choice test. Once you pass those national exams, you'll get a certification. You can take that certification to the fire academy and get your license. Does that make sense?
Yes. So we need to pass both.
Yeah. So if you don't pass this class,
Yeah.
I'm not going to give you an authorization to take any of the national exams. You have to pass this class in order to go on to take your national exams.
Okay, understood. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
On the lines of being able to just theoretic, I can't even speak. So say you don't pass the test on the first round. Do you have the option to take it again with you, or is it a one-time, one done?
Which the test for this class?
Yeah.
It's one and done.
Okay.
But it's not a high bar to success. The questions on your final exam are going to be very similar to the questions that you're doing for your weekly quizzes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Good to know. I just didn't know if it was like the fire academy. I know they give you a few chances.
So we abide by all fire academy rules, and so if you fail the final exam, then I will make another exam for you to take, and you will have a second chance. And the same thing with the skills testing, which in my experience, the written exam is not the hard part. The hard part is the skills station, and particularly patient assessment is really the one that people seem to have a difficult time with. You get
So it's not
remediation
much
the same
different
day.
from the fire academy, because I feel like the skill exam was definitely harder than the actual exam.
Yeah, and there's a lot to remember.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you.
Do you have a current state issued EMR license?
Hey, Max, can you hear me?
Dustin, are you still on?
Yeah, Max.
I don't understand the question. Do I have an EMR license?
No, so it's asking you in the application process, do you have a current non-expired state-issued EMR or higher license?
Okay.
Yes or no?
Do you?
No.
Okay.
So then it's saying the above sections indicate that you are not eligible to take the National Registry exam. Obviously not until you actually get it. I get it from you, correct?
Right. Yeah, you have to complete this course successfully, and then I'll give you an authorization to test.
So just like what you said a couple times with other people that you said. Okay. I just wanted to make sure I was doing the steps correctly.
Yep.
Okay.
And it's pretty forgiving. You can input some information incorrectly, and I can fix it on my end, as long as you select me from that list.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, Max, that was all I had. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Have a good night. And
You
stay
as well.
safe out there tomorrow.
Yeah, I got my snowshoes ready.
Yep, so do I. Have a good night.
You as well. And someone else had a question?
Yeah, I had a quick question, Max.
Yes, sir.
The state BLS exam that's scheduled for Saturday, March 12th, that's is that the final multiple choice exam for this class, or is that?
Nope. That is, so if you complete this class successfully, the last day will be the 26th of February. The test on the 12th of March is for your national registry. That is your national registry psychomotor skills exam. And so if you do not pass this course, you will not show up for your national skills exam. Now, the way that the National Registry works is that the skills exams are done at the state level. And so part of setting up this course, I had to set up that state exam. Now, I have nothing to do with that state exam. None of the instructors that are doing this course can be evaluators for that exam. I can't be an evaluator for that exam. I'm going to show up, but I'm only going to be doing traffic control and moral support. I'll bring my pom-poms for you, but really the hard work is all on you. And that will satisfy the national skills exam part of the National Registry.
Okay, and that, I'm assuming that's probably going to be down in Concord or something.
Yep, that's done at the Fire Academy in the dorms.
Okay, and then another quick question. My CPR card is up March 4th. I'm trying to figure out a date here soon where I can get it renewed. But is that going to be a problem if I don't get it renewed before I take the National Registry exam?
So will it be a problem to take the exam? I don't think it'll be a problem to schedule and take the exam. It will be a problem if you... Actually, you have to enter your CPR expiration date. And so I don't think it will let you take the exam if your CPR expires before you take the exam. So it is certainly in your best interest to get a renewed CPR card as soon as possible.
Okay, yeah, I'm looking around for a class right now and hopefully find one here pretty soon. So.
And even if you take the exam, you won't be able to get licensed until you have a valid CPR card.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Anna, Christopher, Daniel, Melissa, Reagan, do you guys have any questions?